Hello and welcome to Varn blog. And today I'm here with Jared Baxter of Mimbres School. I forget what your exact title is over at Mimbres School.
I'm a fellow.
Yeah,
I'm a
you're a
fellow
fellow.
in politics and philosophy.
Right. And we are talking about your research and basically a course that you're teaching, which is Introduction to Marx and Modern Revolutions, based on writings between 1789 and 1917. And what I like about your text, your syllabus, I haven't read any text by you actually, but I like your syllabus because I find the interpretive tradition of this period both rich and infuriating because the secondary literature tends to overinterpret or make consistent the primary literature in ways that if you face the primary literature, it actually kind of often isn't, and you see where these distinctions really kind of emerge. And in the case of revolutionary history, to add a third component, not just you have the reception of these revolutionary texts versus how they would have been conceived when they were written, you also have the what did these people actually do versus what they said they did, which for me has been an interpretive rubric for understanding Marx and Engels that has been maddening, actually, just trying to reconcile the different positions over time, particularly as we have more and more of their work readily available and in decent translations, and then also their private letters and correspondences about what they expected or the SPD or the internationals to do. And then all of a sudden, it's very hard to actually even talk about something like in my opinion, like an orthodox Marxism or an orthodox Marxist Leninism, because it's quite literally all over the place trying to reconcile this with that and this debate with that debate. And the secondary literature does this, and there's some quite good secondary literature on this. I think Hal Draper's 5-book series on Marx and Revolution is actually quite good. I think Enzo Traverso's recent book is decent. I mentioned to you Neil Davison, but each one of these has something that, like a polemic that they're trying to argue basically by making the history a little bit more consistent than if you just deal with the raw text and try to compare it with what actually happened. You are left with. My first encounter with your classes was a reading 2-session reading series you did on the Black Jacobins and contrasting the kind of historiography that CLR James constructs versus what he doesn't deal with, which is both his kind of for lack of a better word, whitewashing of the French Revolutionary tradition's position on race, which I think you and I both agree is a lot more all over the map than CLR James presents it, and also his just skipping of things like Dessalines. So, Dessalines like a tragic figure in that book, but we're not really going to talk about it very deeply. So that was very interesting to me. So I knew that you came to these texts with a certain amount of historical skepticism about what they were trying to do. So let's start off though with Marx's conception of what early social democracy was attempting to do and their understanding of what bourgeois revolutions were, before dipping into the nitty gritty. So what do you think? How do you think Marxist thoughts on the bourgeois revolution? What do you think they actually were, and are they cohesive throughout his life, or are they kind of a moving target?
Yeah, I think that there is one particular way of framing this question that remains pretty much consistent throughout Marx's whole career, as far as I'm qualified to comment on that, and that's the distinction between political and social revolution, right? In Marx's terms, this maps pretty neatly onto what he thinks of bourgeois revolution versus proletarian revolution, right? And for Marx, this kind of all centers on the question of how to interpret the French Revolution, right? There's an outline, within the early writings, he's got this outline for a book on the state that doesn't seem to have gotten too much further than that, but he talks about the French Revolution as the genesis of the modern state. And this idea of the French Revolution is this origin point. You can also find, elsewhere in the early writings, the Critique of Hegel in 1843 on the Jewish question and the introduction of the Critique of Hegel, 1844. What it boils down to is basically this, right? The political revolution is what gives us political equality, right? It makes us all equal in an abstract way as citizens, right? We're each of us a citizen. We each have equal rights. We are each subject to the same laws, right? We can vote. We can make our opinions known. We can run for office equally, right? It's all very well and good until you turn to the side of civil society, where you can see very clearly that people, in spite of this abstract equalization, remain very unequal, especially if we are talking about questions of money and ownership of property, right? Mm-hmm. So that is the political revolution. It is basically, in Marx's terms, he says civil society emancipates itself from the state. It sets up the political state, i.e. the government, as the realm of the political. Civil society becomes the realm of the unpolitical, right? Your unpolitical, your private life, Of course, these distinctions are not set in stone. There's this dynamic of, well, you can politicize things, right? You can make it a question whether this is a matter of concern for the state or not. But basically, it sets up these two antagonistic spheres, right? Civil society and the state, with the political state in some ways taking important things over from the role that religion used to play, right? These days, insofar as we have these sorts of collective aspirations, insofar as we want to relate to, the people as a whole, insofar as we want to see ourselves as part of this kind of organic totality, I mean, that happens through the state, basically, right? The state is supposed to be the embodiment of the will of the people, right? It's supposed to be this embodiment of popular sovereignty, right? But pretty quickly, Marx realizes that is not actually the case. The state is just pretending to be that, right? And in fact, it constitutes a sphere of its own, which can have certain interests which can even be antagonistic to those of civil society. But the important point is that politics can become a kind of trap, just as, religion misdirects people from looking at changing the material world as they live in it. So too can politics. It's the stuff like, well, you can get people all hopped up over these certain issues, these certain principles, like, oh, it's about liberty, it's about this and that. And so you can have these situations where people are enthusiastically voting for a party that does not represent their economic interests as Marx would understand them, right? Which is, in fact, at base, nothing more than a project of preserving the reign of private property, preserving the domination of the bourgeois over the working class, so on and so forth, right? So this is sort of the critique of politics that comes up in the early writings. Basically, politics is not able to abolish its condition of possibility. For Marx, that condition of possibility is private property. So the idea is, if we organize the social revolution, the proletarian revolution, right? We're starting with the class that owns nothing, that has nothing, that is nothing. I mean, this is sort of what he says in the introduction to the Critique of Hegel in 1844. Because it's nothing, it is the class that really can become everything, right? So he's, of course, paraphrasing C.S.'s famous phrase about the third estate. The third estate is nothing. It wants to become everything. Well, the third estate cannot really do that, because at bottom, it ends up being a bourgeois political project. It ends up being about ownership of private property, private enterprise, right? But the proletarians, those are the ones who can really carry out the true social revolution, where we aren't just changing the form of the state. We're not just changing who's running the state. What we're going to do is we're going to change the economic structure of society itself by abolishing private property And once we do that and carry it through, and after, a certain transitional phase, which, of course, Marx has various things to say, and his thinking on that is one of the main axes along which you can kind of trace the evolution of his thought over his life. But after that transitional phase, basically, we will no longer have politics, right? There's no longer going to be political relations because, according to Marx, political relations derive in the final analysis from property relations. And so once we get rid of that, we're actually going to have the state as the, realized totality of the individual and the collective, this great unity that it's supposed to be, but clearly isn't in this present day, and so on and so forth. So I think that is a pretty consistent understanding that operates throughout his whole body of work, this distinction between political and social revolution, right? Of course, it's not a black and white distinction. Every social revolution necessarily has to take a political form. This is where he differs, for instance, from the Proudhonists, who we'll talk about. We'll talk more about them later on. But the whole point is you have to take political power, right? You need to organize a political movement that will take political power. That's a necessary condition for pushing through the social revolution. But as Marx says in his marginal notes on the King of Prussia, that's another early article from 1844. Once the social movement succeeds in attaining this political power, then the political hull falls away, right? And you see this time and again in the body of writings that we're looking at. We're mainly going to be drawing from the verso edition of the political writings. That is a compilation of 3 books that were put together by David Fernbach, which cover the political writings of Marx and also Engels from revolutions of 1848 period to the end of their lives. And we're going to see time and time again this distinction between political and social revolution coming up. That part is, I think, pretty consistent, right? Even as much as maybe things evolve over his life, he still thinks that this remains the operative and valid distinction for describing what he thinks ought to happen, what he's trying to bring about, namely the social revolution versus political revolutions that basically can't go much further than achieving an abstract equality in relation to a state that merely pretends to be the unity of the individual and collective, and that keeps us in this sort of trap that we're in, where we have these terrible problems of inequality and, of course, the exploitation of the working class.
That's a pretty good summary of my understanding of the positions. One of the things that I've always found fascinating about Marxism versus Marx is the horizons of the state radically changed post 1917. And this is beyond the scope of your class, and so I'm not going to trick you with it yet. But there's a whole lot of new, more formalized schemas of revolution that emerge after that. I mean, the difference between political and social gets broken down even further between political, social, cultural levels of political. The kind of vague schemas introduced by Marx, and then it's unclear to me, even from reading the historical context, whether or not those schemas are because of an imminent critique of positions taken within the First International, or whether or not they are, and later, and also within debates within the All German Workers League, or if there is an actual hardening of a schema that emerges only in the critique of the Goethe program that runs through Marx, because it's not articulated as a schema until Lenin, and then its interpretations become more and more rigid through Soviet and Chinese kind of statecraft. But one of the things that I find interesting that you mentioned is the tension in the state, as you need the political power to basically undo the political power. That's the debate where weirdly Marx is kind of triangulating with the Chartist and Reformist in England, and partially the Blanquist in France against the Proudhonist in France. But he's also not really granting a lot of the Chartist and Reformist want a kind, and the Lassalleans want, which is a kind of permanent state bureaucracy to mediate between the classes to keep the bourgeoisie down, etc. Because increasingly, I think, from his letters, that Marx becomes more and more concerned about class collaborationism over time. Like this become, and so he's in a harder and harder position as to what he's actually advocating, in my mind, because on one hand he's advocating that you need to take the state, crush it, but also create a new one. But your goal in creating a new one is also to immediately dismantle the conditions that would make a nation state possible, so that you would eventually get out of the need for a nation state and society could just administer itself. And I think that's an interesting contradiction, and like it's one of the few things where I'm somewhat sympathetic to like the Bakunin critique, that like, well, how do you think you're going to do that? Like, because in strengthening the state to crush elements of the state, you're going to create all these incentives that's going to make it harder and harder for you to turn this away. And what Marx's response to that is, yeah, but what you want to do, Bakunin, basically is have a very small portion of society lord over everything, and by getting rid of the state, you get rid of the ability of a society to push back on them, and you're just going to use it to like violence. And I find this kind of problematic as you go into 20th century revolutions. I think people just kind of want to make it go away, like. Because what you increasingly see the focus on is state power. And this is one of these areas where I think going back and looking at the beginning actually helps us see the problems towards the end. What do we make of, yes, Marx was involved in the revolutions of 1848, although famously he did not fight in them, as both Bakunin and Wagner would like point out, although Engels did. But where do we feel like Marx got his understanding of Jacobinism, as he states in the well, let me rephrase that. Where do we think Marx gets his understanding of Jacobinism as stated by Engels in the introduction to the class struggles in France? Because Engels is actually a person who states this more clearly. Where do we think that Marx, what tradition of understanding is he pulling from? I mean, other than Hegel's, which I do think he is pulling from that. But
yeah, I mean, that's one of the big questions that I kind of wanted to zero in on in this course. Of course, the early Marx has a plan to write a book about the convention, right? Apparently, this is discussed some letter. Arnold Ruger writes, he mentions that Marx has this plan. It doesn't seem like Marx gets much further with this plan than some preparatory notes, which are like in the fourth division of the Mega, right? His notebooks and such like that. But it is a continuing preoccupation of his, right? I mean, I think that the convention, the radical Jacobin convention of 1793 to 1794, sometimes more popularly known as the Reign of Terror, is a crucial reference point for Marx for a very long period of time, because he needs to find a political form through which his ideas of social revolution could be realized, right? He is not like Proudhon saying that we can just completely do this on our own in society. We'll set up our cooperatives and eventually there'll be a bank and we can just do all this stuff. We don't need to touch political power or get involved with, changing laws or voting for representatives or any of that. Marx consistently stresses the necessity to take political power, right? And the radical Jacobin convention is the crucial example for a number of reasons. I mean, in the first place, you have what the Jacobin convention actually did, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have the famous maximum, right? Basically, price control law, price and wage control law. You have this role of requisitioning in the context of the war economy, where the state basically takes over a lot of the functions that would normally be done by private markets, right? You have this intensification of seizures of land of the emigres, right? A lot of that latter part, a lot of the really interesting stuff remains a decree. Like one particular moment I like is Saint-Just has this decree where he says that the property of enemies of the state will be confiscated and it will be redistributed to indigents, right? So that's a very interesting idea that introduces a redistributive paradigm, which is very different from the ideas of indemnities, which we've seen many times during this period, right? There's the idea that, well, we'll take your property, but we'll give you an indemnity. You see that with, so for instance, with slave owners, they get paid an indemnity to compensate them for the loss of the slave that's been freed. This idea of redistribution is very different because it's not compensation for a financial loss. It's this broader idea that something in society is unjust, and we're going to solve this by taking from those who have and giving to the have-nots. Of course, this decree of Saint-Just does not really get put into practice before he and the rest of the radical leaders of the Committee of Public Safety get put in the guillotine with the Thermidorian reaction. But it does some stuff that remains extremely radical to the present day, right? I mean, here we are, however many centuries later, and the stuff that the Jacobin Convention was able to do, I mean, it puts, a lot of what we've seen, I mean, pretty much everything that we've seen in American politics to shame, right? I mean, sometimes people talk about, oh, we're going to use eminent domain for this and that. I mean, in LA, there's a campaign that's been going on for a very long time to get the city to basically eminent domain this building that used to be affordable housing. And now the guy who owns it, he's not bound by the covenants anymore. He wants to jack up the rent and kick out the people. And they've been trying for a very long time to get the city to purchase the property through eminent domain, i.e. force the sale and then set it up as affordable housing in perpetuity, right? I mean, this is one of the really cutting edge radical ideas to this day. And, it was kind of what the Jacobin Convention would do just for breakfast, right? And the especially important aspect of this, I think this gets into some of the broader themes that I already raised with regards to the will of the people, the sovereignty of the people, right? So the convention, of course, is elected by universal suffrage, right? But these elections take place in a time where things are already starting to get very tense in France, right? Where having the wrong political opinions could get you in real trouble, up to, maybe being guillotined. There's another element of it too, where you have these people, the French people, who were not previously accustomed to vote for much of anything. And now basically every office, down to like even the priests, they would vote on the priests, right? Now they're voting for basically everything, judges, not just the representatives, all this stuff, right? So it was a little overwhelming, right? They weren't really used to that. With the result being that you have this election where everyone can participate, but basically very few people do. I think the turnout is something like 10% or less of eligible voters actually showed up to cast a ballot for their representatives in the convention. And what you end up with is a small group of activists taking control of the power, right? This is important because, you know what, when it comes down to very radical changes, I mean, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about, abolishing property, abolishing prisons, so many things that are floated on the radical left. They just aren't things where you're going to get a huge majority of people saying, oh, yes, we want to do that. Pretty much you have to find a way to get a small group in power that's very motivated to push through these things, even in the face of these not being terribly popular, right? And that is a problem that I think Marx was very conscious of. I mean, this is where the theory of the vanguard party basically comes from, right? I mean, you see, the earliest example of it that comes up in the course is in Engels' Peasant War in Germany, right? He's talking about Thomas Müntzer, who was this he was a much more radical theologian than Luther, right? Luther basically wants to compromise with the bourgeoisie, and Müntzer takes the sides of the peasants and says, let's violently overthrow these aristocrats and these bourgeoisie, and we'll liberate ourselves and establish the kingdom of God on earth, right? And so the difference between the two, Luther and Müntzer, is that Luther represents a kind of majoritarian. He's kind of a middle of the road sort of person who's following the winds of where popular opinion blows. And Müntzer and his party, they represent sort of this radical fringe that's in advance of, many of even their own coalition, and they lead it in the direction that it's going to go. If we're talking about a communist revolution, if we're talking about putting through those kinds of changes in society and in politics, that is what it comes down to, right? You aren't really going to get hordes of people turning out the ballot box to vote for this stuff. You've got to find a way to seize the political power to push through changes that aren't going to be broadly popular. And that's what the convention is a model for, right? So the convention has its limitations, right? Basically, the class basis of the convention for Marx is bourgeois, right? So this comes up on the Jewish question. There's an interesting passage, which I think is the first time, to my knowledge, that Marx discusses this idea of permanent revolution, which becomes very important later on with, for instance, the March 1850 address. But he says, okay, so the state tries to do this stuff. It tries to do the maximum. It tries to do, these confiscations and these redistributions of stuff like this. It basically tries to declare the revolution to be permanent, but it's not able to do that, right? It's going to collapse because the bourgeois political state is not capable of abolishing its conditions of possibility. It's not capable of doing away with private property altogether, right? So, of course, the convention fails, right? That's one point that we're going to be looking at in the course, right? You have 1789, you have 1793. What's the relationship of the two? Marx thinks that 1793 is basically subordinate to 1789, right? It wasn't ever going to be something that would, truly leapfrog what a bourgeois revolution can do and go straight into proletarian revolution. But it provides basically the political model that he has to work with up until the Paris Commune of 1871, right? So with the Parisian Commune, now he has a new structure to work with, which doesn't quite have the limitations that the convention had, right? But of course it fails, but it gives him a new political form through which he can argue that we're going to put these changes through, right? And so, that's some of the reasons why the French Revolution is so important, why the Jacobins are so important to Marx. He's not an enthusiastic Jacobin per se. From his perspective, the Jacobins were basically a bourgeois party, right? They weren't trying to do away with private property or anything like that. But they find a mode of political organization that allows them to drive through very radical changes in a very short period of time. And that becomes sort of starting point and a crucial reference for Marx's theory of political change, i.e., how are we going to make the political change happen?
Yes, and I think your hints about how you have to figure some of this out by reading the letters is actually quite useful. One of the things I realized in trying to understand the debates around what is meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat is that, one, you have to understand Marx's relation to the convention and the Jacobins in the mountain. Then you have to understand, beyond that, how he read what happened with the communards, and what they both provided him as a model, but also what they could not do. And then you need to understand his debates with the Blanquists about democratic legitimacy. But this paradox in Marx and Engels about democratic legitimacy, I don't think ever gets resolved. I know people try to force it to be resolved in their interpretations, but on one hand, Marx does completely see that if you just turn it over even to the proletarian, much less to the general oppressed masses, that it's not that it's not going to do what you want it to do. His hope in the manifesto is that the advanced section of the proletariat, asterisk, we're never going to define what that means, unasterisk, in correlation with socialist, asterisk, we realize that they're not all workers, but we're also not going to talk a lot about that, asterisk, will lead the proletariat in a vanguard fashion, but that they will eventually attain popular legitimacy because they are historically inevitably right from Marx's view. So it's sort of the you'll be granted democratic legitimacy after the fact in the realization, which is the way Marx argues a lot of things. I was looking at his debates about productive and unproductive labor, and you literally can't know if labor is productive until it's valorized. So there's a whole lot of stuff that you only know what category it's in the whole Hegel out, the owl nor flies at dusk, are or flies at dawn problem, that everything you realize that after has already happened. But this does set up a tension, pretty strongly, about democratic legitimacy and democratic norms, and yet also ideological legitimacy, ideological norms, and a kind of maximalist program. And while Marx doesn't take the most maximalist view, he actually, I think, I know a lot of Marxists are going to be mad that I say this. I think he actually deflects from himself by using both the utopians and the anarchists to deflect that some of his own positions would not actually pass democratic muster. And as people have pointed out, if you actually apply the critiques of the utopian socialist and the anarchist to Marx himself, he's actually guilty of some of the things that him and Engels are accusing them of, which is like, no, they're not trying to do workshops of the future, but they do kind of think there's a right way to do stuff, and it's regardless of how democratic it is. And I think even when you look at like ultra Marxist tendencies, like, you know, the left communist traditions, this plays out. There's two spheres of left communism. There's the hyper egalitarian ones, democratic ones, the councilists, and there's the Bordiguists who utterly and completely reject the concept of democracy, not just under bourgeois conditions, but under any conditions. Nor did they want to replace it with a singular leader. They want to replace it with a nebulous party form that's basically run by technocrats. Like, they wouldn't call them technocrats, but, you know, the organic centralism model that Bordiga actually posits is a model of expertise. As decided upon by the party, because the party is the brain of the proletariat, according to Bordiga. And one of the things that I have sort of wrestled with in reading Marx is I think both the councilist and the Bordigist reading actually is justified in Marx fairly legitimately, as are all the ones in between, including the, you know, the Marxist-Leninist Stalinists, the Marxist-Leninist Maoists, the Leninists, the Trotskyists, etc. They all have actually things from Marxist writings. You pointed out Permanent Revolution. You know, basically only two schools picked it up, which is like the most aggressive cultural revolutionist ends of Maoist and Trotskyists pick up on Permanent Revolution in a real way. Everybody else kind of just like backs away from that to some degree. So I find that interesting, because to me it indicates that there's an unresolved problem that Marx is trying to resolve, because he's not, I do not think he's doing what we would see in later Marxist, where they're just impugning to working class popular legitimacy things that there's no evidence that has broad popular support. But there is a sort of like, well, we have the Hegelian in itself, for itself category, and basically the proletariat will have come of age when it acts in it for itself, and we know it acts for itself because it does what we want, like which gets really articulated. And again, this is after the subject of your stuff in Lukács, where this is almost circular. Like there's no way to know or judge, even in the moment, when something is actually, you know, really embodying the methodology of Marx and the spirit of the proletariat, because you can't know until there's an alignment between for itself and in itself, and only when communism exists can you assume that's happened. So there's no way to know, even in the moment of a revolution, if something is actually of a revolutionary moment. He goes way farther than even Lenin does. But one thing I was going to ask you about, and then we can go back to Marx, but, you know, when I was going through your readings of this and I think you do an interesting thing, and we'll come back to this toward the end of our interview, where you put the Marxist tradition in line with kind of the French, I would say, like bourgeois reactionary, as opposed to, say, like the blood and soil, like de Maistre reactionary reading of the French Revolution, because I don't know that that's helpful. But like the Francois Furet reading of you know, the kind of the burnt ex-communist turned conservative bourgeois liberal, almost reactionary reading of Marx. You use that as a backdrop because there's a reading of Jules Michelet in that, which I think is, you know, we haven't talked about this, but I think you think this is, you know, kind of where the Marxist and I say Marxist, I'm impugning Marx of pulling mostly from Michelet, but the Marxist understanding of the French Revolution really kind of comes from is Michelet, and then later on, what's his name? I just blanked. Who's the French Marxist who wrote about the?
Are you talking about Lefebvre or
not Lefebvre before that? But
so cool. There's Mathias is a big one. I think a little bit before Lefebvre.
Yeah, I think Mathias is the one I'm thinking about. Lefebvre is too late, but Michelet is interesting, and I think Michelet is interesting for a variety of reasons, because he's seen as sort of like the prime reading for, you know, revolution, both Marxist and non-Marxist understandings of the revolution in France, but he's really pulling from some very strange historiographic, like, I mean, he's very influenced by like Giambattista Vico, which is not normally somebody I don't associate Vico with the left, for example, like at all. So in fact, most of the people I associate with Vico tend to be on the anti-Enlightenment German spectrum of things, you know, the post-German idealism, romantic reaction end of historiography, not the revolutionary one. So I was going to ask you, what do you think Michelet's contribution to this understanding really is?
Yeah, that is a great question. Michelet, I chose for a number of reasons. With the first session of this course, so one of the biggest regrets I have in trying to put this course together, I got through like 4 drafts of the syllabus before I realized there wouldn't be a way to work in a blow-by-blow narrative history of the French Revolution and still have enough space to give to 1848 and the Parisian Commune and so on and so forth, right? I tried to find a lot of ways to do that. In the end, I settled on giving a conceptual history of the French Revolution, which is a term I derived from Furet, right? So Furet has this book. This might be his most famous book, Interpreting the French Revolution from 1978, right? And in it, he lays out a distinction between 2 types of history. One he calls conceptual, and the other is commemorative. And pretty much all of the histories of the French Revolution, except for very few exceptions that he talks about, are commemorative histories. What does that mean? The goal of a commemorative history, well, let me put it another way. You are starting from the perspective that what the revolutionaries thought they were doing was exactly what they're doing, right? And the goal is to understand what it was they thought they were doing, to figure out where it fits into your personal political position, right? So if you're on the left, right, then you're looking at, you know, examples from the Radical Convention of 1793 to 94. What went wrong? Well, you have the Thermidorian reaction got in the way and prevented some of the more radical things that might have developed had Robespierre not gone to the guillotine or what have you, right? But basically what you're doing in a commemorative history is you've got your own political commitments, and you take the object of your study and you read it through that lens, right? I mean, and that's something that's very easy to do with the French Revolution in particular, because so many things happen which kind of evolve a lot of the crucial debates that exist to this day. I mean, you know, in a basic way, this whole distinction between right and left comes from the French Revolution, right, where people would sit in this hall where the National Assembly would meet, and so on. So the conceptual history, the conceptual approach, it involves a certain critical distance. Perhaps what the revolutionaries thought they were doing wasn't exactly what they were doing. Maybe they were doing something else. What might that be, right? So there, Furet draws from 2 thinkers, Tocqueville and Augustin Cauchin. We'll get to that in a minute. The reason why Michelet is there is because Michelet is Furet's favorite example, and certainly a very great and classic example of the commemorative approach to the French Revolution, right? So we're reading just a little bit of his book. You know, it's 21 volumes. We're reading a little bit of the preface and the first sort of chapter. But in it, he lays out this theory, which, I mean, if you've ever read Michelet, he's very soggy. His prose is very purple. I mean, he's just kind of at this constant pitch of emotional excitement, which apparently was the pinnacle of academic historiography in its day. You no longer write like that as an academic historian, but it certainly is pretty gripping and exciting, and also very strange and weird and at times ridiculous. There's a moment early on in his History of the French Revolution where he sees a mountain and he starts crying because the mountain reminds him of the Middle Ages, right? I mean, this is kind of what Michelet is like. And the portrait he paints of the French Revolution is that there was once a bad time, right? There was the Ancien regime when things were bad, and these heroic revolutionaries came along and they ended the bad times and they kicked off the good times. And if the times are obviously not entirely good, that's just because there's certain obstacles in the way that prevent the universalization of the good. But in either case, there's a clear line to be drawn in the sand between the old and the new. For Michelet, this is an old world typified by theology, right, which depended on a notion of grace that was basically arbitrary. And in this new world, we've got justice underpinned by the principle of equality, right? So we're no longer going to have arbitrary grace dispensed by God. We're going to have true justice, true human justice, right, which looks at humans from the standpoint of human equality and sets the foundation for a world where things are no longer going to be arbitrary. Maybe there's still some arbitrariness, but we're going to overcome it, right? It's this powerful struggle between theology and justice, which still goes on to some extent, but justice gains the upper hand pretty decisively with the French Revolution and kicks off a new era, right? So this is a great example of a commemorative approach to history, right? Because that is pretty much what revolutionaries think they are doing, right? The first conceptual historian that Furet cites, Tocqueville, he has a very different thesis. Basically, his idea is that the French Revolution wasn't this profound radical break between the old and the new. Actually, what it accomplished in the end was to complete the work of administrative centralization that had been begun under the Bourbons, but that ran into certain obstacles, such as you have the existence of these privileged classes where they don't pay taxes to the state and so on and so forth, right? The revolution gets rid of that. It creates a uniform surface for governing in the form of these abstract citizens where everyone's equal in principle, right? And it completes this work of building the centralized government Leviathan, right? So obviously that wasn't necessarily what the revolutionaries at the time thought they were doing, but if they had thought of it in those terms, why would they have done anything at all, right? If you're going to go to the lengths of getting a revolution off the ground and all that fighting and conflict and war, you have to believe that you're doing something really important, right? You have to believe that you're bringing about profound changes that are going to make the world a better place, right? And you're doing away with things that are making the world not such a great place in a pretty decisive way, right? I mean, you sort of need that mentality to get anything off the ground, and that is pretty much what we'll be looking to Michelet for this explanation on an emotional level too, right? An emotional level, why is revolution so important that people are willing to die for it? Well, you need to have some compelling ideas about what you're doing. And there was another point that I wanted to touch on too. You brought up Blanqui, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with a lot of his political thinking, Marx is often taking a middle path, right? So he has this critique of politics, which if you read, the Critique of Hegel, 1843, on the Jewish question, 1844, is really, it's a pretty tremendous black pill of sorts, even to this day. If you think that you're going to make changes by going and organizing and voting for people and so on and so forth, well, Marx just has a giant bucket of cold water to throw on you with some of these early writings. And yet he is not a political indifferentist. That's what he calls the Proudhonists, who say, well, sure, politics sucks. Let's not engage with politics at all. That's not Marx's perspective. He threads a line in some ways that are, well, it can be pretty tough to talk about because you have to make some important qualifications, right? So, of course, with this, any idea of the kind of changes we're going to accomplish with the communist revolution, we're going to abolish private property, those aren't necessarily things that instinctively appeal to the working person in the street, right? They might say, well, actually, I was hoping to save up to buy a house, and then I've got something to pass on to my kids, and I don't like all this stuff about how there's no property and there's going to be no inheritance, and that doesn't appeal to me at all, right? But Blanqui, he's pretty much the leading revolutionary of his day. I mean, compared to Blanqui, Marx was pretty much nothing in his day, right? Blanqui is like this decisive figure. He spends most of his life in prison, except for he gets out, for little periods of time when there's a revolution. But what is his basic philosophy of revolution? He's a conspiracist, basically. He says, well, you and I and maybe a few other people are going to get together and we're going to come up with the plan, right? So, we know that the leader of the country is going to be, on such a route at such a time. And so you'll spring out of the bushes and you'll take him prisoner or assassinate him, and then we'll take over. And then once we do that, well, then the people will spontaneously rise up and say, oh, thank God, somebody finally doing all this stuff that we had secretly wanted this whole time, right? Marx rejects that theory of revolution, right? You need some sort of a popular base, but you also need a vanguard to lead it, right? So that's a little bit tricky, right? Like with a lot of his political tactics and strategies, it's a little bit tricky. But what it comes down to is pretty much what you can see with his work with the First International, right? I mean, you read some of these very fiery texts from the 1850s, and then you read the inaugural address of the Working Men's Association. It's pretty clear that the rhetoric is very different, right? He's no longer preaching fire and brimstone as much as he once was. He's trying to build a coalition, right? He's trying to work with these coalition partners that he has through the trade unions. A lot of these trade union people are what's sometimes called a labor aristocracy, right? They're not necessarily your, destitute factory worker. They're your worker with some kind of skills where they're making a decent living for themselves and so on and so forth, right? They're not necessarily going to go all in for this talk of overthrowing the government and dictatorship of the proletariat and all that stuff, right? But you identify the common points of interest and you can lead them along very gently, step by step, until you get them to a point where they're ready for the full download, right? You don't give them the whole plan right away, but you lead them. For instance, with England, there's this question of realizing the universal suffrage, the voting, right? And you lead them on this path where eventually they come around to see, oh, well, yes, we actually do need to set up this dictatorship for the purpose of abolishing private property and so forth. But you are not doing it completely on your own with a small band of conspirators, and then the popular support comes out of nowhere, right? That's a pretty fundamental distinction that I think is pretty crucial when we're talking about what was his actual plan for how to carry out this revolution.
Yeah, and I think you have to kind of read. There's a double problem in reading Marx on this. One is I think uses Hegelian terms of art, so you don't quite always know what he's really saying. Like when he's talking about advance this or or that, what he really means is like, well, you've adopted our program and you really know what it is, and like the most well-read and educated will be able to pick it up, and then they, even though they're workers, and they'll be able to spread it through. I mean, it's interesting to me because this actually is also a center line in a debate in the bourgeois revolutions that we forget between the democratic legitimist and the enlightened despotist absolutist who we don't think about him so much in the English tradition because Hobbes is associated with the conservative tradition for reasons that in some ways baffle me, because I don't think Hobbes fits either paradigm, even in the English. But that Hobbes is a whole another can of worms. We're not going to get stuck in that. That could be several hours. That you, with like the French, there's a very, like the philosophes are very pro-monarchist because they think, well, we want to liberate the masses, but they're too stupid to do it. So we need a king who has absolute power to push back on the parliament, who's going to slow us down. And because the parliament's going to be an oligarchy. So if we have this enlightened, king that we invest even more power than was historically invested, I mean, way more power than was historically invested into a monarch, then we'll be able to establish this, and then we'll be able to raise up the peasantry and the workers, and they don't really talk about the workers, but basically the laboring classes, and then we'll have an enlightened society, and we can maybe have full enfranchisement there, but we're not going to talk about it before that. And then there's the kind of I guess the like English Republican enlightened majority approach, although none of them really thought that universal suffrage was on the immediate docket, which I think people miss and read, they read back into history. But what's interesting to me is this debate between the kind of socialist and proto-socialist revolutionaries actually does mirror, in a lot of ways, that debate between the enlightened despotists versus the natural aristocratic republicans in the bourgeois and yeoman revolutions. And in some ways, I think people don't think of Marx as a centrist, but in he's not. But in almost all these debates between these radical parties, I am constantly like, okay, Marx's position is actually, I'm taking the middle position between the anarchist and the chartist. I'm taking the middle position between the Podbonist and the Blanquist. I'm taking the middle position between the nationalist and, again, the anarchist. Well, sometimes the anarchists, although sometimes the anarchists are nationalists, which is also very confusing. And I guess between the liberal universalist, actually, and let me phrase that, not so much the anarchist. And when people read Marx, since they often do not read him in the context of his debates unless they're reading his letters, they don't always pick that up. Because even in his polemics, usually you're only seeing him polemicize against one side or the other. You're not actually seeing them both simultaneously to be able to like triangulate what Marx is actually doing. And in that sense, when we talk about the Marxist center, there's a real way in which both the Second International and the early Third International, in so much that they are trying to triangulate between different, more extreme positions, even within their own movement, are in the same vein, where they're taking a position between this and this, and adjusting accordingly. But it's often hard to understand. Because we don't think about the local or international context of this, particularly from the United States, because we don't contribute that much, honestly, to this debate, even though a whole lot of Marx's writing was written for U.S. newspapers. So it's like, it's something that our socialist tradition just was not as much in dialogue with this. Yes, they were. I mean, Henry George, for example, which interestingly now gets picked up by libertarians in America, but funnily enough, but was kind of his own kind of brand of land socialist. And was adamantly opposed to Marx, but praised Marx at his death, et cetera, and so forth. So it's not like the Americans weren't in it, but we don't know that part of our own history for the most part. And we weren't as crucial to these debates as the French, the Germans, and the English were. And then later on the Russians and the Chinese, etc. So, yeah, I think that's really interesting. This brings me, though, to another problem that you get in Marxism in the center position in regards to revolutions, and that's the national question, which is a massive headache for Marxists, and basically isn't answered until there's basically, in the debates between Otto Bauer, Stalin, and Lenin, there's kind of a center position which is carved out by Lenin, which Stalin upholds for most of his early career, but really plagues the situation, and it really plagues the understanding of various things. Like when you read Marx talk about the Slavs, or why we should side with Poland and not Serbia, or which is also very strange considering like later debates in the international and the Second International go in the opposite direction. Or why Germanization is necessary, how we should relate to the colonization of India, where early Marx and late Marx are wildly inconsistent with each other. It is one of the few times in Marx where a reversal is explicit, as opposed to him, where a lot of times you read Marx and it's like he's not admitting he's changed his position. Like, so, but when we talk about like the historic peoples, or his readings of, like, say, the blacks in the America, black slaves and chattel slavery in America, it's actually kind of hard to figure out what exactly Marx thinks. And one of the examples that we can bring up, and this is even pointed out by a Marxist Leninist like Domenico Lacerdo, that like Marx's writings on black slavery in the Americas, on one hand, he very much is on the side of the North and on abolitionism. On the other hand, he says stuff like the Irish have it worse than the black slaves, which is just hard to reconcile. And that, you know, that's dropping any interpersonal bigotry that's used in privately in Marx's letters, or what he said about LaSalle or whatever, because frankly, since he didn't say most of that stuff publicly, he's actually a little bit more progressive than a lot of the other people he's writing with. But his opinions on it, I think, are hard to square, because on one hand, he seems pretty, like, he seems like he's siding with the right side of history, but on the other hand, he's like down the right side of history also. I'm going to quotation that. I don't know that actually means anything. But on the other hand, there are things that he says that even a couple of generations later, not just from our own contemporary standpoint, would have been somewhat shocking. So we can talk about that in relationship to Black African slaves in the Americas, and we can talk about that about how, you know, like what Marx and Engels say about the Slavs.
Yeah. I mean, that gets into one thing I will praise both him and Engels for is at least they state their opinions clearly. You know, they give you the logic behind them. You know, they don't do a lot of beating around the bush. I mean, we're going to see this especially with Engels' writings on the Slavs and their role in the Hungarian revolutions of 1848 to 9, right, where he says some stuff that is pretty unpalatable, to put it mildly. There's also another article. It's Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. This is technically Karl Marx's debut in the New York Tribune, which is the newspaper he would write for I think a little bit more than a decade, right? Sometimes people have this idea about Marx that he was just this lazy guy who went to the library and didn't do all that much. But, you know, he was a newspaper man, right? During the 1848 to 9 period, he runs this newspaper. He's the chief editor. He's putting all this stuff together, right? It's a pretty influential paper. If you look at the circulation numbers, it was getting up there with the leading mainstream dailies of its day. And it was obviously a paper trying to put forward the most radical position it possibly could. So it was a remarkable success, right? And then he goes and writes for the New York Tribune. This is more so during the long years of the reaction in the 1850s, where he has to take a job that he has certain reservations about. But anyway, his debut is this article, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, which, I mean, every one of these articles in the series is signed by him. We learned only much later, I think in the 1930s, when the letters between him and Engels started to be published, that actually Marx did not write that piece at all. It was really written by Engels.
Yeah, one of the things I've learned from reading the MAGA research is like, the MAGA research, MAGA 2 research, not MAGA, is how much Marx farms out on foreign policy to Engels. Like, it's particularly like in the 1840s, he does a lot of his own work, but by the time you get to 1850s, he's like, I'm not comfortable about this. Engels, draft this part, and then sometimes it's all Engels, and sometimes like Marx does the interpretive gloss at the beginning, the end. But that's why it's so hard to distinguish them, because a lot of the journalism is really co-written. So.
Yeah, I mean, they had a breakdown along the lines that you say. I mean, I could look up, I have the mega with the exact quote, but, you know, Engels, he does a lot of the foreign policy, he does especially the military stuff and certain other things throughout Marx's writing career for the New York Tribune, right? I mean, it goes a little bit in the other direction too. Marx has stuff that he farms out to other people. That's something that's pretty interesting in the mega as well. Like, for instance, he's got these 1844 manuscripts, which are very famous now, but were not published until many years after his death. But he would actually go and approach people and say, you know, I've got this thing, it's really not ready for publication, but let me give you, you know, some paragraphs from it. And you can just take those and put it in an article and say it's written by you. It's fine, don't worry, you know. And so, you know, for instance, you see some of these passages being put forward. There's one article, he's working with a doctor. I forget his name exactly, but there's a doctor who has this article. I should look up the title, but it's something like Black Slaves and European slaves or working slaves or something like that, but it's making exactly the point that you mentioned, which comes up again and again in Marx and Engels' writing. I mean, for them, wage labor is literally slavery. Okay, it's a disguised form of slavery, right? In Capital Volume 1, you have this argument that With wage labor, all of the labor appears paid, even though in fact there's an unpaid portion. And with slavery, all of the labor appears unpaid, though in fact there is a paid portion, right? The slave gets food and housing and certain other things, right? Well, that argument has not aged well, it's fair to say, right? But it's
I mean,
pretty
yeah,
crucial.
the only distinction between slavery and wage slavery from Marx and Engels, although it is an important distinction to them, but it's a technical one, that the rate of domination of a slave is constant, therefore they're like a machine and thus are constant capital, whereas you can kind of fudge around free labor and pressure productivity up and down, so the rate of pay for that is variable, which allows for exploitation. Like that's what they think the distinction is, and that's the only real distinction for them. Like that, yeah. So to say it doesn't age well, I just want to, like, it is weird because it recently, because of all the debates around whether or not machines create value, I've had to point out that, like, well, according to Marx and Engels, slaves don't create value either, like, because they're constant capital. And I'm laughing because not that they think the slaves are machines, but they think as far as like capital production goes, that's effectively what they are. Like,
yeah, I mean, there's a passage in volume 2 where I could look it up, but basically he says that they appear to be a form of fixed capital, which returns a certain form of interest, right? I mean, it's like I said, one of the aspects of their thought that has not aged very well, and I think we can tie this back to some of the questions you raised earlier about the national question, and also the early Marx versus the later Marx, right? So, I mean, with the political writings that we are looking at, I mean, their attitude is pretty clear, right? Engels has this great, it's really like a miniature book on the peasant wars in Germany, which we're going to read. And one of the big things that kills this uprising of the peasants, aside from the peasants just being very easy to fool, right? There's time and time again where the nobility, even though their armies are so much less in number and they're in so much of a worse position, they're able to trick the peasant armies into agreeing to a ceasefire, during which the nobility secretly prepares, and the peasant army obviously demobilizes and disperses, and so they lose the upper hand time and time again by falling for this same trick, right? But another problem is that Germany is divided into all these little provinces, and so the peasants have a hard time seeing that they have a common interest with the peasants over there in the next kingdom or duchy or whatever it is, right? That is, of course, a problem that is of crucial relevance to the Germany of 1848, which is, of course, before the unification. You have, I think, more than 30 different states that make up the whole thing, right? Some of them are more dominant than others. You've got Prussia and Austria as being the main players, but Austria, a lot of it is not German, right? There's a German part of Austria, which there's big controversies in the day about what role that needs to play. Do we need to take the German part of Austria and have the big Germany, or can we just leave the Austrians that part of it and we'll have the small Germany, is one of the big debates at the time, right? But in any case, you need the nation in order to really bring the working class together, right? You need a nation, you need to create a national market, you need to create the conditions of possibility for the nationalization of labor, right? I mean, there's a piece, this is another example of something Marx farmed out. This is more, I think this is in the 1850s, early 1850s. One of these chartalist guys, he has this article that he's written about these ideas of labor collectives, right? Okay, so it's a good impulse, but there's certain problems, right? You have your little labor collective that you set up, and eventually it just ends up reproducing the same stuff as the, non-collective regular capitalist companies, right? I mean, in the first place, your collectives are going to start to compete with each other, right? And you have these same dynamics that are going to come up, which is why the real answer is you've got to nationalize this stuff, right? You can't just have your one little collective in one part of the country and another little collective in the other. It's crucial that you nationalize it. In order to be able to nationalize it, you, of course, need a nation, right? Mm-hmm. And that nation building project is on the forefront of the concerns that come up in the revolutions of 1848 to 9 in Germany and Italy and a lot of places. You need to build this structure as a necessary precursor for the things that Marx thinks is going to come after that, right? You can't have an internationally solidaristic working class until you've got things developed up to the level of nations, right? It's not going to happen until you hit that benchmark, go through that stage, right? And this is where we can get back to the early versus the later Marx. So this is something I've been particularly nursing as I've worked through this course. We've got the Introduction to the Critique of Hegel, right? This is 1844. It's one of the pieces he publishes in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher. And it's basically where you have the first explanation of this idea of proletarian revolution in Marx, right? This is the sort of ground zero for that strain of his thought, right? So it's a very important piece in looking at his intellectual trajectory, development of his thought. But in this whole body of writings for this, it's kind of like a magazine, the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, there is this thread going on where he's trying to grapple with the backwardness of Germany compared to France, right? So there's an exchange of letters in this thing where he's got this initial letter where he's like, well, sure, things seem bad. The least, I think he's in Holland, like the least Dutch person is still a citizen compared with the greatest German, blah, blah, blah. But nonetheless, I'm optimistic that, we're still going to get a revolution. He has this analogy about the ship of fools being blown in the wind and, well, it's going to meet its fate, even if it doesn't realize that's what it's doing. Basically, he kind of gives this idea that maybe the German leadership will prove so incompetent that it will bring the revolution upon itself entirely on its own. He gets torn apart by Arnold Ruge in a very funny response where Ruge is basically like, you're ridiculously over-optimistic. There's no way that's going to happen. Have you met any of these Germans? There's no way that this revolution that you're talking about is going to be brought about by them. And later on in this exchange of letters, Marx basically develops this idea where he tries to turn things on its head and say, well, it's because Germany is so backwards that I'm so optimistic, right?
Yeah,
And
this trait of Marxism leads to a whole bunch of unfortunate theories later. I like immiserationism comes from this too, where in the 1850s, where he's like, well, things are going to get so bad under these economic crises that they have to do what like I want them to do because it's the only way to solve the situation. And in some ways, I mean, one of my theories that I've never been able to completely pin out in the mega research, but that like that not happening is part of what really prompts the development of the volumes of Capital. Like that's why the economic manuscripts become so important to him is like, well, my thesis that the workers are going to have to do what I want them to do because otherwise they'll starve just apparently doesn't hold out. And this leads to all sorts of problems later. I mean, like, I do think that when people bring Bernstein, Bernstein for revisionism, and I'm always like, well, but Bernstein's actually doing something he saw Marx do. Like, it is like this historical factor is not doing what we predicted it would do. How do we adjust? So yeah, but I just wanted to put that because there's a lot of that, and particularly in the 1850s, there's just tons of these kinds of predictions where you're basically seeing a theory that's being worked out to kind of flip it on its head. But no matter what happens, this will happen. Like it is inevitable that there will be this revolution, and there's and that's something I've been hitting even up until the 1940s, that basically Marxists did not drop the inevitability languages until the 1940s and 1950s, where they seemingly had to. And most of cultural Marxist critique is Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy shit picked up from fascists. Absolutely true. But the one thing that they're right about is that around the time that you see what people call the cultural Marxist is when you start seeing everybody give up on inevitability of the revolution from either social progress or economic conditions foisting them upon us. And only recently has anyone tried to pick that back up. The whole economic conditions will make this inevitable, which is a debate. But to me, it's not a debate. That's what Marx thinks. Like that's absolutely clearly stated over and over and over again, even though the mechanism that happens by is completely different from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great tensions in his whole body of work. On the one hand, this proletarian revolution is inevitable, but on the other hand, it doesn't seem like you can just sit back and wait for events to take its course. You're actually supposed to get out there and do some political organizing and agitate among the working class and do some stuff that pretty much looks a lot like bringing something about that wouldn't necessarily happen otherwise, right? There's that tension there.
And
With
occasionally gets expressed in forms too when he talks about, well, it's communism or the common ruin.
mhm.
But so he does like occasionally be like, okay, it's not inevitable. There's also the possibility that we all die.
Mm-hmm.
But that's really the only other thing that he really throws out. Like, so anyway.
Yeah, there's one idea that I could put out there that I'll get to in a moment. Has to do with the lumpenproletariat, right?
Oh God, yes.
Right? But with the introduction to the Critique of Hegel, this 1844, there's different layers. One of these layers is that he seems to be trying to construct an argument that Germany can basically leapfrog France, right? For all the various reasons why Germany is not capable, apparently, of carrying out this political revolution along French lines. That's why it's uniquely suited to bring about the social revolution. I think there's some tensions there with that being a proletarian revolution that get worked out later on pretty quickly. Like, obviously, you have to have a certain critical mass of proletarians. This won't happen if you just got like a few hundred in a few cities, right? But what's interesting is that this naive theory in the 1844 introduction to the Critique of Hegel ends up being much closer to what actually ends up happening than the more mature theory that he develops, starting with about the German ideology, right? We'll see this pretty clearly once we get to 1848, but by that time, Marx has settled on this notion that there are going to be stages, and the bourgeois revolution is the necessary precondition of the proletarian revolution. There's this article from his Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Montesquieu 56, where he says basically, he addresses the working class and he says, well, look, I know all this stuff about, the Constitution and whatnot is not very appealing to you, but you need to support it because this bourgeois revolution is going to set the stage for the better world that's going to really emancipate you. Above all, don't get fooled by these people who say, oh, we're going to take things back to some earlier time when things are better. We got to go through this bourgeois revolution, even if it's concerns and demands don't seem particularly relevant to you, the working person. You need to support pushing this thing through because it's what leads to the thing that's really going to realize it, right? And that is also, underpinning a lot of the very unfortunate things he says about, for instance, colonialism in India and so forth. Of course it's bad, but they're setting the stage for this so much better thing that will eventually happen. They're setting the material basis, right, for something that's going to just totally blow away all the stuff that they had in their prior history, blah, blah, blah. But what really ends up happening is that the communist revolutions that we see end up taking off precisely in the backwards countries, right? It's not in the most developed, sort of the leading nations of capitalist development like England and so forth that this thing takes off. Instead, it's in places like Russia and China, which are at nowhere near the level of development as these Western countries. So, that's an interesting thought I've been nursing. Like, in the end, the early Marx was a little bit closer to what ended up happening in the later one.
Yeah, although what's interesting is in these regimes have to go and do the developmentalism that some of the other Marxists like Plekhanov were worried about that they were going to have to do. Like, oh, now you're going to have to do all the capitalist stuff faster and under your own accord and with more force, because how else are you going to get these people to do this? And I guess it goes a little better in China than it does in Russia, but depending on who you read and how you read them. But that is a fundamental problem. And what I find another thing that I find interesting about the 50s and the 60s, that there's like kind of an admission of this problem as a problem in like, say, early, like late Marxist Leninism up to Khrushchev, where it stops, or like early to middle Maoism from like the 50s into the mid 60s in China. And then when it's picked up in France, it's picked up explicitly with this variant of it, where there's like, well, we have to do a new synthesis because there's some stuff Marx was just wrong about. And what I find interesting is later people in those traditions will not admit that they are actually disagreeing with Marxist schemas. They're like, well, that's just the Second International's revisionism or whatever. But in earlier stuff that you read, they admit openly that, like, no, this doesn't follow the pattern that this was predicted, and we have to figure out why, and that's going to require a new synthesis or whatever. And you know, I find it funny because the side that admits you need to revise Marx is the anti-revisionist, because they pick up the name from the first revisionist controversy, but it really has nothing to do with the content. It's just like, well, the last battle was revisionist controversy, so our opinions about Stalin are a revisionist controversy, even though it really isn't that at all. But anyway, back to the time period. I just find it so interesting that when you look at the 1840s, the Marxist historiography around both colonialism and the French Revolution, and also their inability to deal with French colonialism after the Revolution, which we haven't even talked about. Like, they just don't know how to handle that. You are kind of, you can start to see where these fracture lines are going to appear much, much, much later in like world historic conflicts. It leads to stuff like intercommunist wars. Like it does have an effect. Like, so I think that's very crucial. I know we've gotten off the pathway on the national question. So to get back to like to this and colonialism, you know, I think people know more about the Indian stuff because Marx kind of recants it late in life. But what they don't really know that much about is the Slav stuff. So let's go into like the Marx Engels opinions on Slavs as non-historic peoples and what counts as a historic person and a non-historic person. And like, because they also kind of don't think the indigenous are historic peoples either. Like, that's why they don't really factor into like black chattel slaves do, but like indigenous peoples of the Americas are like barely even mentioned at all. So let's go there, because I think maybe that's instructive.
Definitely. What is the issue with the Slavs? Well, you have to start by looking at what's going on in Hungary in 1848 to 9. And probably I should give some background about what exactly is it that's happening in 1848 to begin with, right? Just for benefit of all of the great listeners out there who might not necessarily know. But 1848 to 9 is a very interesting phenomenon because it is pretty much the one time, I think it is the one time in European history where pretty much all of Europe rises up more or less spontaneously at one time. I mean, there's a period of a few weeks where there's almost no government in Europe that's left standing, right? There's these massive revolutions that overthrows the government in France and Germany and all these places, right? And yet within about as rapid a period of time, all the old governments come back and the reaction sets in. And what ultimately is the issue of all of this confusion and back and forth? Well, you get across some certain reforms, right? So one of the books I relied on the most for my understanding of the history of this period is Priscilla Robertson's Revolutions of 1848. With respect to the German context, for example, she brings up that even though these revolutionaries, they totally failed in their attempts to set up, you know, a sort of political power that might be stable, they got crushed pretty quickly. All the reactionaries came back. Nonetheless, they did set the agenda for basically the reforms that took place over the next half century or so. Stuff like unemployment insurance, stuff like free public schools with free books, all this sort of thing actually ends up happening. Pretty much, and this is one of the arguments that Hobsbawm makes in his book on the period, The Age of Capital. Governments find out a way where they can kind of give people what they want in a gradualistic, incremental way that avoids the violence and upheaval of revolutions and keeps them in power, right? That ends up being kind of the takeaway from this whole period, which is, of course, pretty disappointing to your Marx and Engels' types. But with respect to Hungary, at this point in time, Hungary is a part of the Austrian Empire. It's also a place that has had an unusually progressive constitution for quite some time, right? Within Hungary itself, everybody is a noble, right? Everybody has the right to vote. There is this long-standing culture of getting involved in political discussion, political debates that you don't really see nearly as much to the same degree in other European countries. And this all sounds very progressive and exciting until you realize that within this country of Hungary, there's an even bigger population of Slavs who have no rights at all. And with this Hungarian Revolution that comes about, where the basic idea is we're going to set up our own nation, we're not going to be a part of the Austrian Empire anymore, which was sticking them with all these expenses that they thought, they really shouldn't be having to pay, so on and so forth. At no point was there any thought to giving any rights to the Slavs, right? That was never part of the idea. And Marx and Engels are pretty much with, for instance, the leader of the revolution in Hungary, this guy Kossuth, Louis Kossuth, if I'm pronouncing that right, probably not. But they sort of agree with that standpoint. No, the Slavs shouldn't be getting anything. They're just standing in the way of this project that needs to happen. And what it comes down to for Engels, he's got...
the only good Slavs are the Poles, for some reason.
Well, the Poles are a little bit better, right? The Poles get kind of a pass, because, of course, this whole question...
They had a republic at one time or something.
Yeah, they have the Polish-Lithuanian Republic where, everybody had veto power, and they get divided up with this, third partition especially. And so they become this kind of big cause that, everybody in Europe really is passionate about, on sort of the political left side. Yeah, liberate the Poles, give them back their country, especially take it away from the awful Russians and the Holy Alliance with Austria and Germany, right? I mean, Russia is basically the big bad guy in this period from the perspective of Marx and Engels. So with these Slavs, they start getting these ideas. Oh, we're going to have our own republics. We're going to have a Croatian republic, and we're going to have a Slavonian republic. And Engels just thinks this is totally ridiculous. These people, haven't had their own independent history for hundreds of years. He sees it basically as an effort to try and go back to the status quo of the year 800, which is, of course, impossible. He gets very worked up. He even calls them national trash, right? That's the phrase that he uses, Völkerabfälle, in German, which you could also translate in some other ways that are pretty nasty.
Just say that national trash is a nice way to translate that.
You could also say like racial trash if you want. I mean, that's pretty bad.
Rubbish people is another way you could translate that. So
it's pretty bad. And why are they trash? Well, basically because they have no basis for getting this independent republic off the ground. What it means in practice is they're going to be totally dependent on Russia for everything, and so they are inherently counter-revolutionary peoples, right? There's this thing that needs to happen. I mean, Marx and Engels are very into this idea that Germany needs to fight a war with Russia, right? There needs to be a war with Russia, and this is going to be the thing that brings about this big mobilization that's really going to cement the radical project that they hope to see get off the ground. Russia, of course, being the sort of Mordor of Europe, right? It's this hotbed of all the terrible reactionary things that exist in the world. And so there has to be this war with Russia, right? But in order for that to happen, certain things need to happen. Things need to coalesce in the form of nations. They want to have a German nation and a Hungarian nation. And that's going to be sort of the geopolitical setup that is capable of leading in the direction that they want to see. And the Slavs are getting in the way of that, and they advance. This is mostly Engels, right? But he also makes these arguments in Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, which Marx signed his name to, right? It wasn't even known that it was actually written by Engels until decades after his death. So, you sign your name to the arguments. You don't let anybody know over decades that it wasn't really you that said those things. It's hard to argue that you really could have disagreed with the arguments all that much, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where you start getting these very interesting notions where all of a sudden we're back to Aristotle. So in one part of his tirade against the Slavs, he brings up this process of Germanization. The Slavs are getting Germanized. What should really happen is that process should be completed. And he makes some comments which harken back to this notion of justice that you find in Aristotle's Politics, where Aristotle says, if you think that it's unjust that you're enslaved, i.e. it's not really the case that you're inferior and the people enslaving you are superior, well, how did it happen that they managed to enslave you, right? If you really aren't their inferior, then seemingly they wouldn't have been able to do that, right? So that's a pretty nasty, pretty brutal notion, and Engels is bringing up pretty much that in his arguments for why this process of Germanization of the Slavs needs to continue. They shouldn't get their own nations. They should just assimilate into whatever the power is and shut up and let the revolution take its proper course instead of gumming up the works with their counter-revolutionary nonsense, right? He's got many colorful things in those essays.
Yeah, well, this is something that Marxists are often embarrassed about now, because it's also hard to reconcile what them on the Slavs with with the Marx Engels on the Irish, where they take the polar opposite position. And I think this is one of these cases where it's hard to reconcile, and it's also hard to reconcile with later writings where Marx is less sanguine about bourgeoisification, where he's definitely less sanguine about colonial imperialism, and like, you know, this idea that Napoleon is the revolution on horseback, like, for Marx is both true, but it has a regressive character by the time you get to, you know, the middle 1800s, in a way that he did not feel earlier on pretty clearly. And so this, you know, I do think this is hard to reconcile, and I think it's interesting, actually, that this leads to a couple of interesting things later on, but you pointed out with Furet, but I think it's also interesting that it's a problem with Althusser too, where they're like, I can't reconcile this, you know, 1879 Marx with this 1848 Marx. And it's not just the Romanticism. There's a lot of other stuff that has seemingly shifted. And, you know, Althusser, being a good Marxist-Leninist, has to come up with a weird-ass way to make all that work, and, you know, and he does it with. I'm not gonna go into my, like, how tortured I think Althusser's notion of science has to be for this stuff to be true, or like his readings of epistemology, are the fact that he clearly had not read that much Marx when he came up with the theory in the first place. But there is a real, you know, I think Marx's enemies, like Furet, actually understand this a little better, where they're like, only you look at this and there is a pretty significant change. And I think that we can see that in two places. When we talk about Furet, or we can talk about how weird Marxists are about taxes. So actually, we maybe do both. So what does Furet say about this? You know,
yeah, I mean, Furet is very interesting to me. He ended up being so important to the things that we read for this course for a couple of reasons. So I should have mentioned this earlier on. This course that's coming up, it's starting actually in 2 days, September the 2nd. Still time to join if you want to join, for anybody out there. But it is part 2 of a 3-part introduction to Marx that I'm teaching. Part 1 happened last year. It was on the early writings up to ending with the Communist Manifesto. Part 3, which is going to happen next year, fall 2024, is going to be on Marx's Capital, right? So with this one, we're looking at the political writings from 1848, post-Communist Manifesto, to the end of Marx's life. With the early Marx, that was a much simpler course to do, right? I had basically one book. We had this Hackett edition, The Young Marx, on philosophy and society, something like that. It's like the most comprehensive English language anthology that you can find of the early Marxist writings. And our secondary source was this book by a scholar named Gary Teeple, who's a Canadian academic who has this book, Marx's Critique of Politics. And Teeple is very concerned to demonstrate the continuity of Marx's body of work, right? So he's arguing against, on the one hand, Althusser's notion of there being an epistemological break. He's also arguing against sort of a naive notion of continuity, where, like, oh, you look at some of the Rheinische Zeitung stuff and you say, oh, look, Marx talking about alienation. He talks about alienation in later stuff. And so, wow, you know, it's all just the same, right? He's concerned to show the course of the development of the thought that takes place, right? Which occurs in certain stages. And he shows pretty well how you get to certain questions that lead him on to the next thing and stuff like that, right? But he's very adamant about it being basically continuous, right? That has, it goes pretty far in my book. I mean, it shows you why he ends up becoming so focused on political economy, right? But with Furet, this is someone who is also very influenced by the early critique of politics, but he is arguing for somewhat of a break, right? What that argument boils down to, once you get to the German ideology, he kind of throws this idea of alienation away, right? I mean, in the stuff like the 1844 manuscripts, he is still working with these sort of Feuerbachian concepts of there being an essence of man, right? There being this thing called species being, or what have you, that we are alienated from, right? And in response to sort of Stirner's challenge, Stirner kind of has this challenge that, well, this is just an abstraction too. You say, okay, well, you know, we've done away with God. It turns out it's actually man at the root of it. But man itself, this idea of man that you have, that's just another abstraction. You've just replaced an abstraction with a different one, right? Marx is at pains to respond to that critique. He kind of throws out, well, he basically breaks with all of philosophy in the German ideology. He throws that idea out, and he replaces it with this idea basically of history as class struggle, right? Mm-hmm. You can take this materialist approach at history, and you can look at the class relations in a given society, and you can see how things are going to develop, and so on and so forth by these material dynamics. There's no longer a question of being alienated from some sort of essence of man. Instead, what's going on is we see with industrialization, with urbanization, with these things that are going on, that we're moving towards this new stage of human society, what's going to be, you know, the collective is going to really come to the fore, the family is going to break down, and so on and so forth. So Furet says, once you get to this conception, the critique of politics is actually weakened, right? Basically, the idea is that all political phenomena, and for Marx and Engels, it's not just all political phenomena. One of the things we'll see in the Peasant War in Germany is they think that they can reduce religious phenomena to an explanation based on class relations in a given society, right? And one of the things that happens is that politics loses a certain autonomy, right? I mean, there's no longer this notion that people could really be moved by an idea like liberty or equality in a way that moves them to take actions dramatically opposed to their class interests, right? These all ultimately reduce to their class interests in some way or another. There's certainly not this possibility of politics operating autonomously in the way that religion can operate autonomously, in a way that sort of makes things happen that wouldn't necessarily happen if the real motivating force were simply and only these class relations and the economic structure of society and stuff like that, right? So for Furet, this is what this means is that the break that happens in the German ideology renders the later Marx less capable than the former of explaining what happens during the French Revolution, right? I mean, if the French Revolution is what the Marxist analysis says it is in the final picture, in the big analysis, right, which is the sort of announcement of the class dominance of the bourgeoisie, which had been already prepared through these economic developments, but now they really take the reins and overthrow the king and the nobility. If that was all it was, why does France go through all of these changes that it goes through over this whole period? Why was there the Radical Convention, followed by the Directory, followed by the Consulate, followed by the First Empire? Why was that then followed by the Bourbon Restoration and the July Monarchy and the Second Republic of 1848? Why would all of that happen? Furet's argument is that this is something Marx is less able to deal with in his later work than in his early work, where, you know, you still had some idea of the autonomy of politics, and it amounts to a critique of the whole of Marxian class analysis, right? So he ended up being Furet ended up being so important because, like Tiepel, he understands the early critique of politics, and he explains it pretty well, right? I mean, he explains it well enough that I felt I could assign just that first chapter of his book, and that would, you know, for students who weren't able to take the early Marx course, that catches them up enough on what is really at core in that whole aspect of Marx's thought. But he also extends the through line through the writings of the 1848 period, the 1850s, all the way to the end of his life, which Tiepel does not do, right? He kind of shows that there's a continuity, and certain of the ideas in the early writings appear again in various passages of Capital Volume 1 that he quotes, but he doesn't deal with the revolutions of 1848 period, the 50s, any of that. So that's one reason why Furet is so important for this course. He draws this line between the early writings, the sort of middle period, and the later stuff. And he's very influenced by the critique of politics, but he's trying to argue that Marx sort of moves away from certain elements of the critique of politics as his thought develops. And, you know, also he is a useful kind of villain, a useful kind of antagonist to have, right? I mean, the point of this course, you know, I'm not trying to didactically turn people into Marxists. There's supposed to be some controversy and debate. And Furet is a great foil for that because, I mean, as you mentioned, he's also a little bit of a reactionary, right? I mean, he's also an example of what happens if you really kind of throw the idea of the importance of class analysis out the window, right? I mean, for Marx, it becomes this thing that can be used to put politics on an objective footing, right? That can be used to set politics in the right direction. That's going to take us to the post-political society where we no longer have politics as such, right? Well, what if class is actually more so just something like, race or religion, where you can construct a political ideology around it, and it can be pretty effective, but it doesn't necessarily lead us to a world beyond politics, where we no longer have political relations, where we really are, the state really is this realized unity of the individual and the collective and so forth, right? Well, what does that leave you with? It seems like it's hard to make much out of that. So that's another aspect of it.
What I find interesting about Furet in this, he actually reminds me of both the Weberians, who have a questionable relationship to Marxism, like they're kind of social democratic adjacent. I used to repeat the assertion that Weber was once a member of the SPD, although now I've looked up and I can't find proof of that. I've just heard it asserted, so I'm like no longer comfortable saying it because he started his own liberal party in the 1910s. But it also reminds me of the Italian elite school. What makes Furet interesting, unlike, say, any of these people other than, say, Werner Sombart, who we don't read because he's a Nazi, he's a Marxist turned German historical school turned Nazi, and that's why it's so complicated to talk about Sombart. But he's interesting in that since he was a communist for a period of his life, and he's one of the few of the ex-communists that I've read who actually seem to have read and kind of understood Marx, because most of them seem like you got the Cliff Notes and clearly you didn't understand any of it in the first place. And with Furet, no, he does kind of get it. He just takes the almost Italian elite cynicism about what class is. Like, it's like, well, class is, there's always class. Like it just shifts around, and that's how you order politics, and this is kind of inevitable. And what you don't realize is you're doing it too. And the thing about the Marxists that makes them so dangerous is they lie to themselves about it. It's not because they're any different, it's because they're self-dishonest. Like, that's their critique, And I think that's, of the critiques of Marxism from reactionaries, I do think that's the one that's hardest to fight. Like, because in some ways you're like, okay, well, have there been classes in actually existing socialist society? Yes. Have any of them actually achieved? Because one of the things we haven't talked about that much, you talk about why nationalization was important. But that's also a tension, because later on Engels, particularly in the critique of the Erfurt program, like, points out that nationalization and socialization aren't the same thing, although he's not consistent on it either. So it's like a minor point that he makes in the Erfurt critique, and he still signs on to the program, but he's like, no, well, nationalization isn't ultimately the goal is socialization, although nationalization is how you get to it. And you take a modern scholar like Harun Yanez, who points out, well, yeah, that's why the communists had this nation building theory. Once they dropped the historic and non-historic peoples distinction and the Aristotle stuff, they're like, okay, we got to give everybody a nation. We got to make them a nation. We got to create a nation for them if they don't have one, which means we got to have a bit of national language. We got to encourage them to have government assemblies. And what the irony of this is that what they expect to happen is for them to join the international and then give up their nationalism, which they created, which puts the Bolsheviks in some very weird positions. Like, okay, now what do we do with this anti-Russian response that we've actually ourselves fermented and trying to, coalesce these people who were various tribes into a coherent national identity that looks something like Western Europe's conception of a nation. And I think that that's another tension that you see here. And it gets even weirder when you look at, like, well, late Marx on nationalism and whether or not he thinks bourgeois development is inevitable. some people I had the guy from Modest Politics who has more anarchisty leanings, and he was like, well, Marx totally gave that up. I went back and reread all the letters. I'm like, no, he doesn't totally give it up. He actually speaks out of both ends of his mouth towards Vera Zolik and keeps revising the letter. Like, at first it's like, well, maybe they can do it and it can be done, or maybe it has to be done because they can piggyback off the capitalism in Western Europe and then kind of skip it, or which I guess is what people kind of say Lenin tried to do, although he never justifies it that way. And then you get kind of like, he eventually just kind of sends this mamby-pamby form of the letter that doesn't include anything, really. And it's just like, you can tell in his late writings, that he's not able to think himself out of the cul-de-sacs he's in. I also think this is part of why we don't have completed versions of Capital 2 and 3 or a lot of the late manuscripts, and we're working off of, notes on notes on notes. And some of those inconsistencies, I've been reading Kohei Sato stuff on Marx and Prometheanism and Marx eco-socialism, and Sato's reading Marx's notes and his revisions and tried to say, well, Marx rejects his Prometheanism, and I'm like, funnily enough, I'm reading the same stuff, and he does everything you say except that last bit. I don't see where he rejects Prometheanism at all. He seems to like kind of want to have his cake and eat it too. I see this in a lot of places in this time period. I mean, do you see this too? Am I overreading? Am I overinterpreting you here? Because that's my frustration with late Marx, is I feel like there's a whole lot of like almost aporias that he's not able to reconcile, and he just sort of like kind of tries to have it both ways and walks away. Nationalism's one, developmentalism's another. Taxes, even, like, do we have to pay for the state? And it seems provisional in one sense, because like Marx makes a big deal about, a huge deal in the 1860s, 1870s, about like the proto-SPD and the SPD, like funding anything Bismarck wants to do by ever voting for taxes, not just taxes on the poor, like even tariffs and shit. He doesn't want any of it. And when you read like the demands of the Communist Party in 1848, that doesn't make sense, because they're like demanding a progressive income tax, like, or a progressive wealth tax, excuse me. But
yeah, restrictions on the right to inherit and stuff like that. The question about taxes is pretty interesting. I have a provisional answer to this dilemma here. For the sake of background, it is worth noting that this is something that comes up again and again, but generally Marx says that taxation is not the main issue, right? There's this speech that he gives, right? He gets put on trial in Germany. So there's a thing that happens where one of the assembly bodies that they try to set up in the efforts to turn Germany into some kind of constitutional monarchy, things go south, and this body declares the abolition of taxes, right? And Marx he immediately jumps on this push, right? He publishes this article, no more taxes. All taxes are abolished. Don't pay your taxes. That's what he gets in trouble for. He gets put on trial for this. He gives a speech where he's talking about how, these taxes, they often seem to be the proximate cause of a lot of the big revolutions, right? You have the English Revolution. You have Charles I's ship money, right? You have the French Revolution. Obviously, the whole taxation question is the precipitating question of the Estates General being called, and so on. But what's really at issue is not the taxes per se. It is the class struggles underneath that are really driving things forward. So you have this newly developed bourgeois, and this state form is no longer the appropriate state form to the present social conditions, and that's really what's at issue with the struggle, right? It is interesting that Marx makes these fairly anti-tax statements, but what really clarifies this is, I think this is in the class struggles in France, right? So the big demand of revolutionary France in 1848 is the right to work, right? And this is a slogan that persists to this day. It's taken on a different meaning. These days, right to work is like an anti-union thing, right? But in 1848...
A great bit of opposite rebranding from its historical usage.
Right. Yeah. So in 1848 France, the right to work is what survives this day. Actually, this came up. I can remember people talking about this during the last Sanders campaign. What was that? 2016. It's the job guarantee, right?
The job guarantee is what it means, and it's like, and that's a pre-Marx socialist thing. That's going all the way back to Louis Blanc, right? Like the workhouses are a way for, we have a right to work and you have a right to income, but you're doing productive work, so no one can question that. And if we can't deliver it to you, well, the state will make sure you have, like, we'll be the employer of last resort. And that's still, that comes up at MMT uses it. It's I mean, it's even part of, like, honestly, even the fascists used it as part of their social stabilization program. But it's broadly speaking was a popular demand. And I just find it funny in America that it's come to, we have to use a jobs guarantee or something like that because we can't use right to work anymore because it got rebranded in the 40s.
Yeah, it did. And at one point in the class struggles in France, Marx pits this right to work demand against another demand, which goes in, according to him, basically the opposite, basically a reactionary direction, which is the right to assistance, right? So that is the stuff that we're familiar with, the unemployment insurance, you have your food stamp programs, you have your subsidized health insurance, all of this stuff, right? It doesn't undermine the power of capital the way that the right to work would, right? The way that guaranteeing anyone who wants a job would undermine the power of private employers, the private sector, right? This right to assistance, it instead fills in the gaps and buys off some of the potential anti-capitalist antagonists, and it buys them off, according to Marx, pretty cheaply, right? So with this whole question of taxes, the important point, I think, is what are the taxes being used for, right? You can use taxes in a way that makes the possibility of a revolution less likely. I mean, this is in fact basically CS's whole program with respect to the question of the French national debt. CS is like the big theoretical leader of the French Revolution. He comes up with the idea of there being a constituent power, which basically is the structure of these French revolutionary governments. You have the Constituent Assembly, it constitutes the power, and then you have a constituted power, legislative assembly. He also has some very important ideas about the debt, right? There was a debate. I mean, the whole Estates General getting called, that is because the French state is in big trouble. Financially, it's teetering on the precipice of bankruptcy. It's clear that taxes need to be raised, but nobody can agree on whom and by how much, right? So looks like we need to call an assembly for the first time since like the 17th century, right? And there was some discussion at that time that maybe we could just declare bankruptcy. Maybe the king could just say, well, you know what? I'm not going to pay this. I'm sorry, I don't have the money. Tough luck, creditors, but you're not getting your money back, and let's move on, right? That was certainly an option that the king could do, but CS said absolutely not. The whole reason that the king has called us, into this assembly is because of the debt. If we get rid of the debt, then we lose the only leverage that we have over the king to push through this constitution that we want to see and these other changes, right? So actually one of the first the very first actions undertaken by the National Assembly after the famous tennis court oath and so forth is they guarantee the national debt. They say, yes, there's no way we're ever going to repudiate this debt. It's permanent. We're committing forever that we're going to be bound to this debt, right? And this has a number of advantages for CS, right? I mean, once you have this permanent debt, you're paying interest on it. The interest keeps growing. That means taxes keep growing. That means people keep having to pay more taxes. And that means they take a greater interest in what these taxes are being spent on, right? It also means that businesses are going to look for ways to reduce their tax exposure, which, you could do by making your processes more productive, right? Making things a little bit cheaper. You pay a little bit less tax, so on and so forth. So, that is basically how we get this whole bureaucratic apparatus that we have. And, the stuff like social welfare stuff, it comes a little bit later. The free education, the unemployment insurance, social security, it all comes a little bit later, but it follows from this general idea that we're going to have this ever expanding bureaucracy, which, is basically cemented in place by this permanent debt that we constantly have to pay more and more towards. And what it's going to do is it's going to raise the price of political risk, right? It's going to raise the price of the risk of massive political change. Like you can see pretty easily, I think, if you're a person in the early 19th century France and you lose your job and there's no safety net, and so immediately you get thrown out of your apartment, you've got no money for food, and this happens to lots of people. Well, you very quickly get a lot of people who are in the streets who are very angry, you have nothing to lose, right? And with the social welfare, you diminish that quite a lot. You give them something to lose.
What I love about this is it puts Marxists in a weird position. We'll talk about the weird position because it comes up both in respect to the lumpenproletariat and in respect to some of the seemingly stranger parts of the critique of the Goethe program that people ignore. Like Marx doesn't like public education, for example, as long as it's provided by the state. Like he's like, well, the state, what does he say? The state can ensure that teachers know what they're talking about, and that's it. And particularly wrote the program, which I think most people are kind of like, what? Marx is against public schools? Yeah, kind of. He's not against social public schools, but he actually is against state public schools. I think the other thing that's a hint about Marx's feelings about taxes is that he doesn't call them taxes. But when you talk about the provision of social surplus and critique of the Goethe program, that's effectively a form of taxation. It's not a taxation on profits or income or anything like that. It's a setting aside of general surplus to take care of reinvestment, the people who absolutely can't work, because Marx, I don't think he wants the elderly and the poor just to die, and he doesn't want them to become lumpen, right? So those are the two things he's thinking about. And so like those are the people you're allowed to make social provisions for, but everyone else, it is you work, and we'll make sure you work because we don't want these, quote, dangerous classes. But what I find interesting in the CS argument, and it's picked up in the United States after the Civil War too. I mean, when we say we're not going to repudiate the national debt, that's part of what's going on here. Is it leads to an administrative state. I think, interestingly, that Marxists don't see how strong and stable it's going to become, particularly in the light of world wars. So much so that like by the 1950s, you have Marxists arguing like, I don't even know how we'd have an insurrectionary revolution anymore because of like the strength of the state, the social welfare net, the nuclear bomb. I don't know. Like, I think that's actually part of what the whole monopoly capital stuff is about, which is an attempt to economically work out what they're politically realizing. Mm-hmm. That's beyond the scope of your class, but it's something I think a lot about because that's when we see both the inevitability language dropped and Marxist categories about economics largely get abandoned, are redefined. So you have monopoly capital, which means something very different for Baron and Sweezy than it does for anyone who used the term before then. You have basically the idea of class warfare is abandoned, and people like it, they talk about it with the Frankfurt School, but it's kind of abandoned across the board. But I think that I think we have to get to this problem because this leads to the creation of the lumpenproletariat, the non-class class that really fucks up all the categories. But also does, my stance on this, it actually does describe something real, and it's hard to talk about because when you look at like how Marx defines it, one, it's the refuse of all classes. Two, it's the decayed parts of prior classes that are just left behind. Three, sometimes it's service workers and menial laborers who aren't productive, but sometimes they aren't in it. He can't really decide, particularly when you look at the letters. Four, then there's all these other hybrid classes that kind of have a similar character to it, but Marx doesn't want to put in there because he doesn't think they're engaged in the same kind of things. Although, like, there's this distinction in Marx between intellectia and literati that's kind of funny. It's like, okay, so what's the difference between intellectia and literati? I don't really know. I guess one works for the state and the other doesn't. That's really the only distinction you can come up with. It seems to be, it's kind of, for Marxists, it becomes a real problem. And this is where you introduce two modern secondary scholars, two people who are influential on me. You mentioned Hal Draper's volume 2 of his works on Marx and Revolution. And I just going to tell people, if you can find the time to read all 5 volumes of that, some of that scholarship is outdated and it's definitely pre-mega work, but it's a pretty useful book. Or, well, books. It's a lot of pages. But I would also say, I think Clive Burrow's book on the dangerous class and the lumpenproletariat actually does get into the problems of the concept fairly honestly, even though he wants to hold on to the concept and use it to explain some things. But I mean, one of the things that I think you have to kind of look at when you look at the lumpenproletariat is Marx actually has a couple of different definitions that aren't actually the same. They seem the same if you're not reading closely, but when you think about them, they're not the same. Because I think the refuse of all classes versus the decayed social classes of prior forms aren't really the same thing. But what's your take on that? What do you think the lumpen does? With my long introduction to the concept,
I mean, that's one of the important concepts in this course, because we're not really just here to look at these texts just in the context of their historical whatever. I mean, the idea is to try and find something that might be relevant to our present day situation, right? I mean, we're in a period of time that I think could be loosely, but not meaninglessly compared to like pre-1848 Germany that Marx experienced, right? We have this situation where we have these ossified political institutions that no longer have all that much in the way of legitimacy in the eyes of the people, and yet it seems like they're not going anywhere. There's no alternative. Nothing is really going to be able to strike a blow, and so we're stuck in this weird situation, and it doesn't seem like there's even all that much to really do, right? So the lumpenproletariat, that's an interesting concept, right? I mean, you could even look at it, I mean, if you wanted to be cynical about it, you could just say, well, eventually Marx and Engels realize that the proletariat doesn't actually behave in the way that they think it ought to behave according to their theory, and so they just invent a bad proletariat. That's the reason why all of these things are happening that contradict their theories. But it's more than that, right? I mean, the 18th Brumaire, one of the most striking statements in that whole text is, I think, where he says that Louis Napoleon, as well as his entire administration and so forth, they're lumpen proles. Well, that seems pretty crazy, right? I mean, this guy is he's the Emperor of France, right? He's famous for these very garish like buildings that he builds, these theaters and stuff with all the gold leaf and these elaborate frescoes and so forth. I mean, that doesn't really seem to have very much to do with this idea of proletarians, which is in the word lumpenproletarian. Oh, but use it. They come from all classes, right? It's the refuse. It's whatever isn't playing a productive role. It's like thieves. Like, so Louis Napoleon is kind of a scammer, right? He's kind of scamming the state and directing money from the state to his own pockets and running this grift, basically, to use a popular word. It's also people like beggars, and I think prostitutes are also put in there at some point, and stuff like that. What is interesting about the Clyde Barrow book to me, and this is a guy who has a really bad case of Trump derangement syndrome, which is pretty unfortunate, right? I mean, the conclusion of his book, like the last paragraph, he invents this term Trumpentariat, which is constantly swelling and growing and blah, blah, blah.
Right. And, I mean, he thinks the basis of the Trump support is the petite bourgeoisie, which I think is a common thesis among Marxists. Somewhat myself included, but also the lumpen proles. But he says they don't vote, and I'm like, so they don't show up, and I'm like, I can't prove that one way or the other the way you've constructed this argument. Like, so, and I also cannot tell who you actually think is a lumpen prole, because there's an expansion of the category in some ways in that book, and I start to play with it just like some other people. I literally just did a video on making it a verb, about the foreclosure of organization and future orientation and like the things that we associate with criminality. But again, not all kinds of criminality refer, like, I remember arguing with someone who's like, well, organizing strippers is organizing lumpen proles. And I'm like, well, but not all unproductive labor, even according to Marx's lumpen proletariat. Like, in fact, what productive and unproductive labor has to do with the proletariat is actually frankly never stated one way or the other. It's hinted at. I will say it is hinted at, but like Marx doesn't definitively define proletariat with a hard definition anywhere. Like, actually, and that's a dialectical like methodology problem, but it is a real one, because famously, when you get to the part of Capital Volume 3 where you're supposed to finally get the fucking definition, it stops. Yeah. Like, it's just like, it's like, no, the whole thing we're debating about, and yet there's tons of ink. I mean, theories of surplus value, large sections of the economic manuscripts of 1861 to 1864, a little bit of Capital Volume 1, most of Capital Volume 2, get devoted to this problem, and the problem of also valorization versus creation, which isn't helpful in German because the word that they use means both things. So, like, valorization, yes, there's a technical difference, but valorization, valorization it's almost synonymous with creation sometimes in Marx, and not in others. So to me, this, like, the lumpenproletariat is interesting, but the problem that you have is it's not, as a category. I mean, the one point Burrow has, I think, is legitimate. You can't make it a class the way everything else it's a class, because there's no consistent, if you look at the list that he gives, like, clear relationship to productivity or even legality. Like, it's not, it's basically, so on one hand, I'm totally with you. I think the endnotes people try to make it where it's just, okay, well, Marx had to invent a sub-proletariat. I think one of the problems that you have now, though, and that Burrow doesn't really deal with, is how much of the traits and tendencies we ascribe to the lumpenproletariat are totally common in the working poor who are still employed full time. Like, you can't get around that, and not just service workers either. Like, it's like, logistic workers, certain kinds of factory workers. I mean, the participation in things like the drug trade and whatnot, which Marx would have abhorred, is totally common. It's just a sociological fact in those classes now. So it's a category that I find interesting, because you're right. In some ways, you're right. We are in a period that does feel a lot like Germany in 1848, but in some ways also like, okay, where you have the universalization of the wage relation, but now it seems like the conditions of the lumpenproletariat are way more common. And if you get out of the developed world, it's even more true. Like, so, a lot of the third worldists answer this. Oh, well, it's the real proletariats in the developing world, and the developed world's all labor aristocrats or whatever. You get into the problem, well, how do you explain how much of this lumpenization and precaritization is endemic to the developing world if productivity is the defining factor? And so I find it interesting because, as you know, I've been reading a lot of this work, and you mentioned Furet again in this section, so we'll come back to Furet's interpretation of this. But I find the lumpenproletariat both absolutely necessary and utterly baffling to how, like, it fixes the problem that what Marx sees, because it also seems to create tons of problems. Like, for example, like the reserve army of labor. Well, most of the reserve army of labor would be lumpenproletariat for Marx, and yet in Capital they're good, and in the political writings they're bad. Like, I don't know how you like reconcile that. So anyway,
Yeah, I mean, one of Furet's pithiest critiques of Marx's approach to class analysis is that, these class distinctions, these class analyses are derived from the very events that they're supposed to explain, So, okay, well, 1848, why did that fail? What happened with the rise of Louis Napoleon? Well, there's these two parties. There's the party that represents landed property. There's the party that represents, the industrial capitalists. And they have this sort of, he's deriving all these things from the events as they play out. When he tries to predict things, which, I mean, with a scientific theory, you're supposed to have some ability to predict outcomes, right? For whatever your object of study is. It doesn't work out too well, right? And the thesis about the Barrow book that I think is interesting. I mean, aside from he gives a very great historical overview of this lumpenproletariat concept and its evolution over time, he says he finds there's a certain tension in Marx, right? This whole idea of the proletarian revolution, as Marx conceived of it, it had a lot to do with the factory labor scenario specifically. Like, it had a lot to do with getting so many people under the same roof at one time, right? That you really kind of heighten these contradictions. Everybody is physically in the same social space with each other. They can see, well, you know, there's all of us, and there's just such a tiny group of people who really own and drive all the profits and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, for instance, in Capital Volume 1, he says this is not the case with the industrialized agriculture, where actually the tendency is to spread fewer and fewer workers over a larger area. And so you're not going to get a revolution from there. You need to have the people coming together. You need to have this critical mass. You need them to see that they can really seize control of the means of production, and they don't need the capitalist telling them what to do, and so on and so forth. So there's that. But Barrow says, you know, there's a sort of tension as Marx works through his theory in Capital, where he kind of starts to see that maybe this isn't inevitable, and something else that could happen as things develop is you could just end up with more and more people being pushed into the surplus population and becoming lumpenized, and becoming this sort of dead weight as far as getting any sort of revolutionary project off the ground, right? So,
well, the immiseration thesis, which I do think Marx holds on to in the 1850s, would be a lumpenization process, and that's what I don't. That's another thing I don't understand. I mean, I know it's before he really comes up with that, with that as a major category, but it does seem like, okay, well, if you're forcing everyone into the reserve army of labor, then what is the difference between them and the lumpen proletariat? The only thing I can see at that point is morality. That is it. Like, and we're explaining morality by class position sometimes, like, but not consistently. I mean, because the other thing about Marx on class positions and politics is there's also an admission, yes, we can't predict an individual's politics by their class. We can only predict the grand movements because history is made in aggregates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also, that's a special pleading for me and Ingalls, because we clearly don't belong to the class that we're supposed to belong to. Not as anyone who's the leadership of these parties. Have a nice day. Goodbye. Like, you know, and that's something that anarchists throw at them now, but they threw it at them at the time. Like, you're not of the class you were saying that you were representing, and that was not lost on people even contemporaneously. So, you know, that's one of the things I find very frustrating when you talk about lumpenization, because in this case, Marx thinks it's predictive of individual morality and individual action. Maybe. But in other cases, he doesn't seem to think that really at all, because also if he was right that class determination was politically determinative in a one-to-one way, you don't need a vanguard party. You don't need any of this political apparatus. Like, that seems to be completely unnecessary then. You know, I have, you know, I've thought about this for 20 years. I do not have a way to reconcile those two positions. Anyway, you know, so I guess for those of you who are listening, it's like, is this Varn's long dark night of the Marxist soul? It's like, yes, it actually is. Like, these concepts of revolution do bring this stuff out. And I think one of the things about taking a class like this, to you know, pivot and let Jared talk about, we're gonna get the Lenin in a second, but about this is I think if you really follow this concept of revolution closely, you can see why there's problems later, and you can also see like why this is a particular problem for Marxists. One of the things I was reading Alvin Guldner's book on the two Marxisms that he pointed out, that I was like, he's like, yeah, nobody else actually relies on theory and scientific predictability for their politics the way Marxists do. Like, it is unique to Marxists that they claim to, you know, both have an epistemic solution and an ideological solution and a politics. Like, nobody else makes that kind of grand claim, and operates with that kind of grand claim. So, you know, it is a hard thing to deal with. But yeah, and I'm with you on the lumpen, because it's a tension. Like, if you take the immiseration thesis, what you're saying, and I think like the Black Panthers actually picked this up, you're saying that by that thesis, the lumpen should be the most revolutionary class, right? Because they're the most shut out of society. And that's even kind of implied in the whole proletarian thesis. Why does the proletarian have nothing to lose but their chains? Because there's no way that they can benefit in the class structure no matter what. Therefore, because of that, they are a universal subject, because the only thing they could possibly do is abolish the current situation. But then if you follow this stuff out with the lumpenproletariat, that's not the argument. It can't be. Like, the argument's actually no, working actually teaches the workers and ennoble them. They're still shut out. They're basically, you know, all but slaves. They're not quite slaves. They have free labor, but it's more of a technicality. And through their cooperative efforts and working in the factory, you know, they've become a cohesive unit, and they're skilled, and they can shut everything down. But those two theses actually aren't really the same. They're a little bit in tension with each other, and because they're hidden in the same concept, we don't tease those tensions out. I mean, you know, and a friend of mine, a former friend of mine, they're an enemy now, used to point out that this is a real problem with like dialectical thinking, because a lot of times you can just posit two opposed things and hope the thing that you want emerges out of that opposition, like in the same people in the same time. And I do think we can see some of these problems being like, you know, how do we get rid of capitalism? We spread it. How do we get rid of nationalism? We encourage nations. Like, it does seem in each case, the kind of center path that Marx is taking is also paradoxical. But anyway, I'll let you pick back up. So what's your conclusion? Like, how satisfying do you personally find this lumpen thesis? Are, you know, I mean, this is one point where I think Furet is actually kind of, I think Furet does kind of have a point where it does seem like, well, lumpenism does seem like a post hoc justification for your problems, more than it actually is an explanation or predictive. Although I guess we can kind of say people try to use it as predictive in regards to fascism, and other forms of Bonapartism. But then again, what Bonapartism is starts to move around too in the 20th century. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, you know, for me, well, the lumpenization stuff, it has an intuitive appeal just because I feel like on a moral and spiritual level, you have a lot of people who feel like they are superfluous, right?
Right.
You know, people who feel like they're not needed in this world and they have nothing to do. There's nothing for them to gain or accomplish. They're not going to make any difference, right? I mean, you get lumpenized in a way just with this kind of institution of neatdom that develops where it's like, well, okay, I guess I'm going to be sitting on my parents' couch and playing video games into my 40s. And, well, you know, people's lives need to mean something to them, right? But we kind of have a void of that sort of meaning for a lot of people. And really the question is, well, what do we do? Are we really just here to, you know, we'll enjoy a nice cup of tea and, you know, we'll have some good friends and we'll try to be good people to them and to our families. And meanwhile, we watch the whole world fall apart around us. Is that all that we really have to do in this life, right? Or do we have a chance to actually change things in some way? I mean, I'm somebody who used to be very active in political organizing on the left, and I got very disillusioned with it for various reasons. And that's where I got into the critique of politics, right? The early Marx, you kind of see how these things really just feed into strengthening the state, which is never going to really abolish its own conditions of possibility, right? It's never really going to solve the problems. It's just going to find ways to administer them a little better. And within that framework, well, you can maybe get a position at a nonprofit, or you can get a position in the government, and you can make a nice life for yourself. But what if we really want to change things? You know, is that still possible? And if so, what do we do? As far as this course goes, I mean, I don't think the conclusions that we're going to draw from that are going to be that positive, but they're also not wholly negative either, right? I mean, Marx does have some fairly specific answers to some of the problems that you raised, like with 1850. There's something that happens in 1850, early 1850, which is very interesting, which I set up the syllabus in such a way that it's going to highlight this aspect of it, where there's elections in France that deliver these tremendous big gains for the Socialist Party in France, right? And so initially Marx and Engels are very excited. They see this as being the starting point of a new phase of the revolution, right? Things are going to get moving again and things are going to start moving forward. And this is where you have this idea of economic crisis come to the fore, right? So, I mean, immiseration on its own, basically people get used to stuff, right? They get used to living in a certain way. You don't really have a chance to get a claw in to make revolutionary change unless there's a crisis. And suddenly what little people had gets taken away, or maybe they had a decent living and now they don't anymore. And that's where people really get upset. And that's where you need somebody who's got a plan, who steps in, who explains, well, angry people, here's what we're going to do. And they capitalize on all the anger and resentment that came from the crisis, and they lead it in a specific direction to realize a specific goal, namely the communist revolution, right? So there's a lot of different factors in play. With the first text that we're going to be looking at in 2 days, we start the course off with Engels's introduction to the class struggles in France. I mean, he talks about how do you make a revolution happen, right? I mean, that's a pretty important question, right? I think people like you and me and people who are listening to this, probably we don't need to be too much persuaded that a revolution might be desirable. We probably already have some ideas about where we would want to see it go. But the big question is, how would you make something like that happen, right? So there's a little bit of a story that Engels tells about technology. Of course, weapons technology got quite a bit more advanced over the course of his lifetime. You no longer had a situation where the people in the streets and the soldiers of the government would have basically comparable arms. Right nowadays, of course, they've got things like tanks and helicopters and planes that no regular person is going to have. But even then, Engels says you would very rarely defeat the army militarily, right? It's not like you fight a battle with them and win. What more often happens is you get the army to come over to your side, right? Mm-hmm. The army gets out in the streets and the people are there, and the army sees these people and they say, wait a minute, these are my family members. These are my people, not this king or this czar. And you know what? I'm not going to listen to that guy's orders. I'm going to switch. And that's, of course, what happens, for instance, in the February Revolution in Russia, right? I mean, pretty directly, you have the military defecting from the czar. And that's kind of what turns the tables and dooms the czarist regime to its end. Well, I mean, how far have we come? The contemporary American left, how far have we really come to make those kinds of inroads with the military? It doesn't seem like too much, right? But even if this older idea of revolution, this whole taking to the barricades and getting people in the streets, even if for a lot of reasons that's not necessarily all that viable as a path to making significant political change in the present, neither do I think we're in a totally post-revolutionary age. I think, on the contrary, to kind of develop this comparison between our present day and 1848 Germany, to develop that a little further, Engels has this distinction between revolutions from below and revolutions from above, right? Mm-hmm. I think we have just lived through one of the greatest revolutions of above of all time. And that is the 2020 COVID crisis and the pandemic response, where, just as in 1848, all of Europe rises up simultaneously, in 2020, world governments, pretty much all of them, with very few exceptions, within a very short period of time, adopted a series of totally unprecedented, very sweeping measures that just a month or two before, not many people would have considered possible, right? You have this, to get back to the early critique of politics, this antagonism between the political state and civil society. I mean, this is one of the most amazing examples of that we've ever seen. You have the political state basically saying civil society needs to shut down, stop seeing your friends, stop seeing your family, don't go to work. We need to lock things down to reduce the transmission. And I think it also did turn out to be more of an 1848 than a 1789, and that it pretty quickly failed, right? You have the counter-revolution of reopening, and eventually all of these restrictions and such go away. But we saw such a profound transformation of even the most basic social norms in such a short period of time, right? That I don't think that we can say that we are totally done with revolutionary changes in our lifetime. On the contrary, we're likely to see some pretty dramatic and transformative events. The question is, well, what can we really do to shape them in a direction that might lead to something better, that isn't just this sort of general decline and collapse into some kind of Blade Runner scenario? Well, I'm not sure that Marx, or this course on Marx and modern revolutions, really answers that, but we can learn something from the clarity with which they address these questions and tactics and strategy to try to solve the problems of their own day.
Yeah, I think that's a good place. I'll spare you the questions of London State and Revolution, but it is, the revolution from above issue is actually kind of fascinating, because the one thing I would add to that is I think we've seen many abortive revolutions from below, but they were all abortive. We've seen a bunch, and I don't just think they're of left-wing character either. I think they're all over the place ideologically. And we've also seen, from the standpoint of classical Marxism, we've seen a bunch of Bonapartist figures emerge on left and right too, and not just in the United States. In fact, I would argue that the United States got them late, that they started in other places actually around 2006, 2007, and we don't really get them in the United States until Trump, although I guess you see the hint of it in the Obama campaign. But there's such continuity between what Obama actually does and prior politics that it's hard to say. Whereas, like, there is something interesting about the nature of Trumpism that I think none of the left really wants to talk about in a very real sense. You know, we talked about the Trump derangement syndrome. Is like, well, how much has not changed under Biden, and how many of Biden's programs that the left defends actually began under Trump during the COVID crisis. And I think quite clearly, actually, it seems like, well, a bunch of them, and we're just kind of not talking about it because we've been kind of blindsided by the actual implications of these massive changes. And yeah, I agree with you that 2020 was one of them. I kind of think it started in 2007. I think there really was a real change in our fundamental economic structure that was hidden, that changed, like that I think just as big as neoliberalism, and just like we didn't realize what neoliberalism was well into the 80s, even though it probably started in the early 70s. I think people are just now realizing that, like, neoliberalism as we understood it and as we've been naming it and using it probably started to end around 2008. We actually just don't know what we're living in right now. And so, you know, in so much of these names mean anything, I mean, you know, one of the things about, I think there's some people in Mimbres School who probably would deny that any of these periodizations mean anything at all. But I have had this, I agree with you. I found thinking about Marx in all of these figures. I mean, Blanqui, Bakunin, the Second International, the crisis of the Second International, Lenin, even Stalin, to be very helpful in this time period. But also, I keep on hitting some of the same, you know, like cul-de-sacs and aporias that I mentioned earlier. Like, Marx has some answers to some of these, but others, if you read closely, it seems like he's kind of frankly throwing spaghetti against the wall and hoping you don't notice. Like, because he's, and it's not, I don't think it's because he's anti-scientific or trying to fool anyone. I think he is trying to work it out in real time, and it's unsettled, and he doesn't finish the project, like, if it even could be finished. And that, I guess, that becomes the thing to answer, because to me, one of the biggest questions is, why has everyone been talking about the crisis of Marxists since like 1965, or like really the late 50s? Like, Marxism's been in a perpetual crisis of Marxism since then. Even when, if you look at the 60s, it was on the march. His, like, as far as like territories that claim some allegiance to it, it was like a third of the planet at that point. And yet, and it's definitely not that today. I mean, China basically is the big holder of population, but other than that, you've seen a massive fallback. But even during the time of growth, like really serious growth in the 60s and 70s for Marxists, there was already a feeling of intellectual malaise, and that there was a major problem. And it wasn't just in the Soviet Union. Like, it was pretty generalized. And it showed up in multiple tendencies. You know, I think about like the great debate between Althusser and Lukács, between, you know, the Hegelian Marxists and the structural Marxists, or the critical Marxists and the structural Marxists. And they're both saying, by like in the 1970s, like, there's a crisis in Marxism that none of us have solved intellectually. And it's also not just true between, like, people will pretend today, oh, it's just the Western Marxists that have this problem. No, go and read the stuff in the Hungary and the Soviet Union and even China. There's an intellectual crisis in the 70s, you know. And it's all beyond the scope of your course. But what I find interesting is the more I study this time period and these shifts between Marxist writing in 1848 and Marxist writings in 1879, the more I do see where, okay, these problems were there from moment one and we kind of knew it. Like, now the larger Marxist political movement did not know it because so much of this was not published. But, you know, Marxist interlocutors, including leaders of the parties, knew it because it was going back and forth in letters. We see it when letters between Marx and Babel, Marx and Engels and all kinds of people. I mean, who wasn't he talking to? The number of times they threatened to not represent the SPD and then, like, but also endorse what they do. It's kind of wild to try to figure this out. So I'd like to thank you. I'm going to run this. I normally don't run these immediately. I'm going to run this tomorrow. So those of you listening, when you watch this, you have 24 hours to sign up for Jared's course. But I'm going to do a Friday special because this is my favorite topic to talk about, which is the history of Marxism and how we kind of got in this weird state that we are in today. And B, I will endorse everything you say, but also leave you on the Christopher Lasch question. When Christopher Lasch asks, "Is Marxism obsolete?" or "Is revolution obsolete?" Excuse me, he doesn't ask Marxism obsolete. Although the question of "Is revolution obsolete?" is about "Is Marxism obsolete?" And Lasch's answer seems to be no, but I can't really tell you the answer to how it's not. Right? Like, that seems to be like his answer to it. It's like, no, I still think revolution has meaning, but obviously some kind of understanding that we've had either become too metaphorical on one end or too locked in the 19th century on another, and we can't think our way out of it for whatever reason. And I ironically, that was written in the late 60s. I feel like it's still true.
Well, you know, I mean, this whole 21st century experience that we're having, and there was a book I was reading, Asef Bayat. So I started to develop this question. Once you really get the modern social welfare state, once it's sending out these, you know, checks and these food stamps and the unemployed are drawing this income and you get the Social Security and so on and so forth, do you ever really see a revolution along the lines of what you see in 1917 Russia or 1848 France? And there are some counterexamples, right? So there's this scholar, Asef Bayat, who writes a lot about the Arab world, right? And well, of course, you have the Iranian Revolution of the 70s, right? The Shah, who was overthrown, was trying to build a modern westernized state along a lot of these lines. You had the free education, you had other stuff. But what seems to have made the difference there was you had kind of this idea of a national identity, right? There was the sense that the Iranians were just kind of condemned to be imitators of Western political and cultural life. And they pushed back on that and they said, no, we're neither East nor West, we're our own thing. You had these thinkers who were bridging Marxism with Islam in interesting ways, right? So there's a religious component too. So, I mean, you can get a revolution off the ground if you have a compelling idea, in spite of, you know, the apparatus of the bureaucratic state making that, giving people something to lose, basically, to where the bar gets higher for getting something like that off the ground. But you can still do it, right? Maybe it's not the most relevant topic for how we're going to make the sort of political change that we would want to see in the near future, right? But if we've moved on from it, we sure do see a lot of things that look a lot like revolutions in terms of mobilization, but then seem like reforms in terms of their actual effects. That's one of Asef Bayat's point. He's applying it to the Arab Spring. But we had an even better example of this recently with, the BLM movement, the George Floyd protests and stuff like that. I mean, that was like the biggest public protests in terms of numbers that the country has ever seen. And what were really the impacts? What really got off the ground? We certainly didn't defund the police. We definitely didn't abolish them, right? Even some of the more sensible policy ideas like, oh, maybe we'll have these like little social worker strike forces that handle the mental health calls instead of the police, is barely getting off the ground at all. The main impact of it seems to have been maybe it helped Joe Biden get elected a little bit, right? So that's sort of the interesting contradiction that we're in. I mean, we have these things that seem revolutionary in terms of the level of mobilization, but it seems like we kind of just need better ideas. Maybe that's it, right? Like you get the people out in the streets, but you need somebody with an idea. Here's what we're going to do, such that we're not just registering our disapproval of the way things are, but we have some sort of actual plan for turning them into something different that would be better. It seems like maybe we need something like that, but well, then why don't we have these revolutionaries? Why aren't there the people who step forward? Like you can look at Sri Lanka, for instance. I mean, that state collapsed pretty recently. The government in Haiti collapsed pretty recently. There were times in the past where somebody might have stepped forward and said, all right, now we're going to do a Marxist, social republic or something like that. And then, well, we don't seem to have those people anymore. So this is where we kind of get into anti-politics, right? It seems like the social base for the political class, if you want to call them that, the social base of political parties in the United States has been declining for a long time, right? You used to have these unions that were big, strong supporters of the Democrats. You used to have these evangelical churches that were big, strong supporters of the Republicans, and all of that they're losing their numbers. They're getting eroded to varying degrees, and it's becoming increasingly antagonistic, right? I mean, Trump and Brexit is a pretty clear example of antagonism on the part of civil society against the political establishment as a whole. Oh, you think this is a bad idea? Well, we're going to do it for just that reason. We're sick of you, and we're going to stick a middle finger in your face just to show you that we're not going to fall into lockstep with all the stupid projects you want us to do anymore. So maybe that's somewhere to start. Is it going to lead anywhere? I'm not sure of that yet, but
the center has had remarkable sticking power, and it's been able to play these different factions off of each other for about a decade. I don't know how long it's going to be able to continue to do that, but like, it has been sort of amazing to me. But both, like we said, would like, what is the difference between Biden and Trump? It's largely style in how antagonistic they are with the administrative state. Although, if Trump was reelected, I don't know that would be true. Like the conditions are so different post 2020 that I don't think you could predict Trump round 2 off of Trump round 1 either. And so like the whole thing is a very hard question to answer. Plus, I mean, this hasn't come up in our conversation, but we have some serious crises coming down. We got obvious decoupling. We have climate change. We have what looks to be an economy that can neither grow nor go into true recession because there's not enough people to have an unemployment crisis. And I literally can't think of a capitalist society where that's ever been true. But that also means like, well, how would you encourage your normal levers, both through the welfare state or through jobs, don't seem to be a way to re-stimulate economic growth. Also, it's not like economic growth has been super low. It's been about 3%, which is, I guess kind of a late capitalist norm. But people are experiencing that pretty negatively. So yeah, I'm in agreement with you. It's going to be really interesting and knock on wood that interesting doesn't mean we all die. Pretty interesting to see what happens in the near future, because it does feel like a whole lot, like COVID seems to have reset a whole lot of status quo politics, but it's not taking. So for example, a year ago, I thought that like Trudeau could like literally kill 5 babies on the street and probably still get reelected in Canada because there was no real opposition. I no longer think that's true. And while conservatism is very unpopular amongst the young, and the Republicans did a lot worse than you would have predicted in 2022, progressivism is becoming more and more unpopular. So it's hard to see where that goes either. It's just, And I've been looking at these polls that have been saying that both capitalism and socialism are unpopular in the United States right now. And so it's like, well, okay, the historical other options that emerge from here have not generally been good. So I want to know what you guys mean. Like, so anyway, thank you so much, Jared. I'm glad you came on. As you know, as I've been excited about this is one of my favorite topics. And I'm glad to talk to you about it because you've read enough of this to get why I have, where people don't understand why I have like heart palpitations discussing this stuff sometimes, where I'm like, I don't understand the answer to this, and the answer does matter. Like it is actually of importance to have an answer to this question, and I do not have it. So and I would love people to just admit to me what the texts say so we can talk about whether or not we can build an answer from this, as opposed to pretending the text says something it doesn't say. And maybe the answer isn't found in a text. Also, I mean, that's another thing about Marxists where we both oppose book worship and do it. So it is a difficult thing. Thank you so much. People should definitely check out your class over there at Mimbres School. Check out Mimbres School. I think there's a lot of people who think Mimbres School is a lot more an scholarly and ideological lockstep than it is. Colin Drum has brought together a bunch of fairly diverse and somewhat contentious scholars, and there are debates in there. So I watch them in the members Discord all the time. So I would definitely tell people to check it out. And if you can't afford to take a full course, definitely audit. That's not expensive at all. And I think they're changing the way they're going to allow the auditing, but it's something you can definitely do if you want an example of past courses and at least get access to the material once it's completed. Yeah, and you guys sometimes do like book study groups that are semi-open to you. So if people want to pop into one of those before you join, there's usually just, I guess, if go to the website and find that out, right? Like I know that Jules was telling me she was going to do one that was going to be open to the public as a kind of like, well, if you want to see what we do, here's what it is. Here's, we're going to do a reading group and you can get a feeling for what's going on. So I do think those happen, right?
Oh, yeah. We do reading groups. We have little one-off or sometimes longer reading groups depending on the book. And if people are interested, you can find us online. The website is mimbres.study.garden. That's Mimbres, Mimbres. You can also find us on Twitter at Mimbres School. If you're interested, let us know. We'll get you onto the Discord. We do charge money for the courses, right? We find that it's important that people have some sort of a stake in it. That kind of keeps them motivated to stick with the whole course, right? But we don't turn anyone away for lack of funds. If you're interested in participating but can't make the tuition, let us know. We can work something out. And we're at a stage where we've been growing quite nicely, and we want to keep that going and bring on more people. So we would love to hear from you, meet you, if you're interested in the sort of stuff that Varn and I talked about today.
Yeah, I would definitely suggest it. It's a very interesting, and it's interesting in a lot of different topics. It's not all just arguing about whether Marx or Hobbes is right, despite what you might sometimes glean from Twitter or from my talking to Colin. But there's classes on the political role of anthropology. There's classes on the political role of horses, which I thought was going to not be as fascinating as it ended up being. To make a joke related to the most recent Barbie movie, horses and patriarchy are a lot more related than you think. Just like that joke was accidentally insightful. So check it out. And yeah, I would tell people to check it out and participate. And also the courses I think they're usually around $250, which for the kind of course they are is a pretty good deal.
They're $250. You get a rebate for each session that you attend to. So it's like I think it's a $15 rebate for each session you attend. So there's 8. So you can do the math. It ends up being quite affordable if you want it to be. And of course, we'll work out a deal if that's still beyond your means. So, let us know. Thank you so much for having me, Varn. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Yeah, it's really great. And I'm going to hit the end music.